In the year 343 BC, the last native pharaoh of Egypt fled into the desert. He had just lost the most important battle of his life, and of 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The Persian army of Artaxerxes III had broken through his defences at the fortress city of Pelusium, in the same northeastern corner of the delta where Egyptian independence had twice been extinguished before. His Greek mercenaries had fought well. His Egyptian troops had held longer than anyone had a right to expect. But the Persian advance had been methodical, overwhelming, and in the end unstoppable, and the man who carried the oldest title in the world, Pharaoh, son of Ra, living Horus, lord of the two lands, rode south into the dark with what remained of his army, and did not stop. He would not come back, not to rule, perhaps not to Egypt at all. His name was Nectanebo II, and he was the last of a line that stretched, in one form or another, for more than 3,000 years. Not the last pharaoh. The title would continue to be used by Persians and Greeks and Romans for another 6 centuries after his flight, but the last pharaoh who was Egyptian, the last person to hold that title who had been born in the Nile Valley, raised in the Egyptian language, formed by the Egyptian religious tradition, and governed through the pharaonic framework from the inside rather than adopting it from the outside as a tool of imperial administration. After his departure, the pharaoh would always be someone else's king wearing Egypt's crown. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Nectanebo II was, but what his story reveals about the specific, irreversible moment when one of the most ancient civilizations on Earth finally passed beyond the ability of its own people to govern it on their own terms, and what the archaeology, the inscriptions, and the remarkable afterlife of his legend tell us about how deeply that loss was felt, and for how long. Let that sink in. 3,000 years, that is the span of continuous Egyptian civilization from the first unified kingdom to the moment Nectanebo's horse carried him south from Pelusium. 3,000 years of unbroken institutional memory, of priests who had learned from priests who had learned from priests, stretching back to the dawn of recorded history. 3,000 years of a single theological vision, the pharaoh as the embodiment of divine order, the living maintenance of Maat, the axis around which the cosmic machinery of the universe turned. And then, in a single campaign season, it was over. The world Nectanebo governed was not the world of the great pyramid builders. It was not the world of Ramesses II's colossal statues and his wars in Syria. It was the world of the 4th century BC, a world in which Alexander the Great was a teenager in Macedonia, in which Plato was teaching in Athens, in which the Greek city-states were exhausting themselves in the conflicts that would eventually leave them unable to resist the Macedonian power building to their north. It was a world in simultaneous transformation across every dimension: political, military, intellectual, commercial. And in the middle of this world, in the Nile Valley, a native Egyptian pharaoh was building temples, sponsoring an extraordinary artistic renaissance, assembling his armies, and trying with everything available to him to hold the oldest civilization on Earth together against a pressure that was, by this point, structural rather than merely military. He failed. And his failure was not a failure of intelligence or courage or commitment. It was the specific failure of a man standing at a specific moment in history when the forces arrayed against the thing he was trying to preserve had become, for reasons that were only partially within anyone's control, finally and definitively larger than the thing itself. The story of Nectanebo II is not a story about decline. It is a story about the specific conditions under which 3,000 years of civilizational independence come to an end, and about what survives and what does not, and why the ending does not erase what came before. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The Egypt that Nectanebo governed had already survived one Persian conquest and reasserted its independence. The Saite dynasty, Psamtik and Necho and Amasis and all the others who built the late period's most commercially brilliant era, had ended in 525 BC when Cambyses marched through Pelusium and made Egypt a province of the Achaemenid Empire. But Egypt was not finished. Within 60 years of that conquest, the Egyptians had revolted, expelled the Persians, and begun 3 dynasties of native rule that represent, across 138 years of independence, one of the most culturally productive and militarily active chapters in the entire history of the late period. Nectanebo II was the last pharaoh of the last of these 3 dynasties, the 30th dynasty, and his 18-year reign was one of the most remarkable of the entire era. He built more temples than any ruler since the New Kingdom. He assembled a military force that successfully repelled 1 Persian invasion before losing to a second. He became, after his flight from Egypt, one of the most mythologized figures in the ancient world, a shape-shifting magician king whose legend grew for centuries across multiple cultures, eventually becoming one of the most widely circulated stories in the medieval Mediterranean world, and almost no one in the modern world knows his name. This is the story of the last native pharaoh of Egypt. It ends in the desert and in the dark, but it does not end in defeat. Not entirely. Not in the way that matters most. To understand Nectanebo II, you need to understand the extraordinary resilience of a civilization that had already survived 1 conquest and built something remarkable in the interval between that conquest and the one that finally ended it. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BC had been absolute and sudden. Cambyses II had destroyed the Scythe dynasty in a single campaign, installed Persian governors and Persian administrative practices, and incorporated the most ancient civilization on earth into the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. For 60 years, Egypt was a Persian province, paying tribute, supplying soldiers for Persian campaigns, managed by satraps who answered to the imperial court at Persepolis. The great temple establishments continued to function, as they had always continued to function under foreign rule, because the Persians understood that disrupting Egyptian religious life was the surest way to make the province ungovernable. But the political form of pharaonic sovereignty, the native Egyptian pharaoh, governing through the theological framework of Mat, of divine kingship, of the living Horus maintaining cosmic order, was absent for the first time in 3,000 years. Then, in the 490s and 480s BC, Egypt began to revolt. The revolts were suppressed, sometimes brutally, by successive Persian kings, but they demonstrated something important, that Egypt was not simply a province that had accepted its new status. The memory of pharaonic independence was alive, maintained by the temple establishments, and the local aristocracies, and the ordinary Egyptians who understood themselves as the inhabitants of a specific, sacred land that had been violated by foreign power. The revolts failed individually, but they expressed a persistent Egyptian will to self-determination that would eventually produce the most remarkable development of the late period, the expulsion of the Persians and the restoration of native rule. The expulsion came gradually across the late 5th century BC, as the Persian Empire became distracted by internal conflicts and by its ongoing wars with the Greek city-states that had been the defining external conflict of the early 5th century. Around 404 BC, a native Egyptian ruler named Amyteus of Sais, the only pharaoh of what Egyptologists call the 28th dynasty, effectively expelled the Persians from Egypt and established himself as an independent ruler. He ruled for 6 years, operating primarily in the Delta, never fully consolidating control over Upper Egypt. When he died without heirs, power passed to a family from Mendes in the eastern Delta, who founded the 29th dynasty and ruled for approximately 20 years. The 29th dynasty gave way, around 380 BC, to the 30th dynasty, the dynasty of Nectanebo. The founder of the 30th dynasty, Nectanebo I, was a general from the western delta city of Sebennytos, who seized power from the last 29th dynasty ruler and established the line that would, through his son and his grandson Nectanebo II, produce the final native Egyptian rule. This sequence, from Amyteus's initial expulsion of the Persians to the end of Nectanebo II's reign, covers approximately 60 years of native Egyptian rule, 60 years between the first and second Persian conquests. Within those 60 years, the native dynasties built temples, sponsored religious life, engaged diplomatically with the Greek world, and maintained an Egyptian military force that successfully repelled at least one major Persian invasion before succumbing to the second. The math is striking in a way that most accounts of this period fail to make clear. Egypt had been conquered by Persia in 525 BC. It expelled the Persians around 404 BC. That means Egypt was a Persian province for approximately 120 years. And then it was free for 60. And then it was conquered again, this time for good. The 60 years of freedom were not an interlude. They were a genuine civilizational achievement, a restoration of native rule across the full length of the Nile Valley, sustained for 3 generations and expressing itself in one of the most intense periods of temple building in the history of the late period. To understand how remarkable this was, you need to understand what the Egyptians were recovering from and what they built with the time they had. The discovery that most transformed modern understanding of this period came not from Egypt itself, but from a sequence of archaeological and textual work that assembled, piece by piece, a picture of the 4th century BC that earlier scholarship had systematically underestimated. The British Egyptologist Alan Lloyd, the same scholar whose work on the site period was discussed in earlier chapters of this series, wrote in the 1980s of the modern era that the 30th dynasty, and specifically the reign of Nectanebo II, had been almost criminally neglected by modern scholarship relative to its actual historical importance. He noted that the building programs of the 30th dynasty were, by the measurable standard of surviving temple construction, the most extensive of any period since the New Kingdom, a fact that was visible in the surviving monuments but had not been adequately integrated into the popular or even the scholarly understanding of the period. What Lloyd and subsequent scholars assembling the picture of the 30th dynasty found was a civilization in full creative expression, consciously reaching back to its deepest traditions, while simultaneously engaging with the most contemporary forces of the 4th century Mediterranean world. The archaizing program that the Seti period had pioneered, the systematic reaching back to the oldest available Egyptian models as a source of cultural legitimacy, had continued through the 28th and 29th dynasties and reached a new intensity under the 30th. The temples that Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II built across Egypt are not the desperate constructions of a civilization in its last days. They are the confident, technically accomplished works of a tradition that knew exactly what it was doing and believed it would continue. The temple at Philae, the island sanctuary at the First Nile Cataract, near the modern city of Aswan, that became one of the most sacred sites in the entire ancient Egyptian world, received its earliest surviving construction from the reign of Nectanebo I. The gateway that stands at the entrance to the Philae complex, known as the Kiosk of Nectanebo, is one of the most perfectly proportioned, small structures in Egyptian architecture, a freestanding colonnade of columns with elegant platform capitals, standing before the later temples on the island, with the quiet authority of an original statement. The kiosk is small. It is not a colossal monument in the New Kingdom tradition, but it is beautiful in a way that repays sustained attention. The proportions are exact, the carving precise, the relationship between the columns and the sky above them, and the water around the islands, so perfectly calibrated that the structure seems to have grown, rather than been built. Nectanebo II continued and expanded the work at Philae that his grandfather had begun. He also built or expanded at Karnak, at Luxor, at Abydos, at Dendera, at Edfu, at Memphis, at Heliopolis, at Tanis, and at sites across the delta that are now either buried or destroyed. The building program was systematic and sustained, a deliberate investment in the physical infrastructure of Egyptian religious life that served simultaneously as theological obligation, political statement, and economic stimulus. The specific discovery moment for understanding the scale of this building program came when Egyptologists working in the 19th and early 20th centuries began the systematic inventory of cartouches across the major temple sites, the royal signatures inscribed in the oval rings that identify which pharaoh built or contributed to each structure. At site after site, the cartouche of Nectanebo II appeared with a frequency that surprised scholars who had not expected a relatively late and poorly documented pharaoh to have left such extensive marks across the sacred landscape of Egypt. The evidence was not in any single dramatic find. It was in the accumulation, the cartouche here, the foundation deposit there, the building inscription at a third site, that eventually produced a comprehensive picture of a building program matched in the late period only by the most ambitious of the Sete pharaohs. This building program was not simply a matter of royal vanity or theological obligation, though it was both of those things. It was also, and crucially, a political program. The temples were the institutional backbone of Egyptian civilization, the centers of economic activity, education, medical practice, artistic production, and administrative organization that made the civilization function at every level. A pharaoh who built temples was a pharaoh investing in the specific institutions that generated and preserved Egyptian identity. He was, in the most concrete possible sense, building the infrastructure of the civilization's continuity. Nectanebo II built more of that infrastructure than any ruler of his era. He built it beautifully. He built it with the full technical vocabulary of a tradition that had been refining its craft for 3,000 years. He built it in the full knowledge, one must assume, that the Persian threat was always present, that the recovery of independence had been hard won and was not guaranteed to last, and that the temples he was building were the most durable expression of what Egypt was and what it meant. He was right about the durability. The temples outlasted the dynasty. They outlasted the Persians. They outlasted Alexander. They outlasted the Ptolemies and the Romans. Some of them are still standing. The man who built them deserves to be known. The world in which Nectanebo II ruled was not simply an Egyptian world. It was the 4th century BC Mediterranean, a world undergoing the most rapid and consequential transformation in the history of the ancient Mediterranean basin. Understanding this wider world is essential for understanding the specific pressures that Nectanebo faced and the specific choices available to him. The defining figure of the 4th century BC Mediterranean world was not yet Alexander the Great, who was born in 356 BC, 1 year into Nectanebo's reign. The defining figure was the Persian Empire of the Achaemenid dynasty, now in its mature phase under a series of increasingly able rulers, reaching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the borders of India, administering through the satrap system, a territory so vast that no previous empire had approached it. Persia was the dominant power in Nectanebo's world in the way that Rome would be the dominant power in a later Mediterranean world, the organizing reality around which every other state had to orient its strategy. But Persia in the 4th century was not the Persia of Cyrus the Great, the military colossus that had absorbed Lydia and Babylon and seemed capable of absorbing everything. Persia in the 4th century had already failed, twice, to conquer mainland Greece. The battles of Marathon and Salamis and Plataea had demonstrated that Greek infantry and Greek naval tactics could defeat Persian forces even when massively outnumbered, and the memory of those defeats shaped Persian strategic caution for a generation. The Persian Empire was still enormously powerful, but it was a power that had come to understand the limits of its military effectiveness against certain kinds of opposition in certain kinds of terrain. Egypt had been one of those limits. The expulsion of the Persians around 404 BC had been followed, in 373 BC, by a massive Persian invasion attempt under the king Artaxerxes II, an invasion that the Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo I had successfully repelled. The repulsion of the 373 invasion was one of the more remarkable military achievements of the late period. Egypt had held off the Persian Empire at the peak of its 4th century power, relying on a combination of the delta's natural geography, the flooding of the Nile, the professional skill of Greek mercenary soldiers, and the organizational effectiveness of the native Egyptian military tradition. This success shaped Nectanebo II's strategic understanding of Egypt's position. If his grandfather could stop a Persian invasion in 373 BC, then a properly defended Egypt could maintain its independence against Persian pressure. The lesson he drew, and it was a reasonable lesson from the evidence available to him, was that Egypt's security required the same combination that had worked for Nectanebo I. Greek mercenaries of the highest quality, effective use of the delta geography as a defensive barrier, and the maintenance of a native Egyptian military tradition capable of supplementing and supporting the professional mercenary corps. The Greek mercenaries who served in Egypt during the 4th century BC were not the same kind of Greek soldiers who had served under the Sete pharaohs 2 centuries earlier. The military revolution that had been transforming Greek warfare across the 5th and 4th centuries had produced increasingly professional, increasingly mobile, increasingly versatile soldiers who had learned their trade not in the seasonal militia traditions of the earlier period, but in the continuous, high-intensity conflicts of the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath. The mercenary commanders who offered their services to Egyptian pharaohs in the 4th century were men of genuine military sophistication, people who had served in multiple campaigns across the entire Mediterranean world and who brought with them the most current tactical knowledge available. Nectanebo II cultivated these connections with deliberate care. He made Egypt an attractive employer for the best available Greek military talent, offering the combination of generous payment and the institutional backing of the most ancient and most legitimate civilization in the world. A Greek soldier who fought for Egypt was not fighting for a local tyrant or a city-state faction. He was fighting for a civilization whose antiquity made the entire Greek tradition seem recent. This combination, Egyptian resources and legitimacy, Greek military expertise, had been the foundation of the Sete military for generations. It remained the foundation of the 30th dynasty military, and under Nectanebo II, it achieved its most sophisticated expression. The specific Greek commanders who served under Nectanebo are documented in the ancient sources with unusual specificity. Diophantus the Athenian, Lamius the Spartan, and most significantly, the Athenian general Iphicrates, one of the most innovative military tacticians of the 4th century BC, who participated in an Egyptian counteroffensive in the 370s BC in a campaign that, had it succeeded, might have fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance of the ancient Near East. The discovery of the specific papyrus evidence for this period came through the systematic Egyptian papyrological work of the 20th century, which assembled from the widely scattered finds of the papyri in Egypt's desert conditions, a picture of the administrative and economic life of the 30th dynasty that had previously been almost entirely inaccessible. The papyri, administrative documents, legal contracts, temple accounts, military records, provided the first-hand evidence for the daily functioning of the 30th dynasty state that the monumental inscriptions alone could not supply. When Egyptologists working with these papyri in the mid-20th century began to reconstruct the economic and institutional profile of Nectanebo's Egypt, what they found was a state of considerable organizational complexity and surprising prosperity. The temple establishments that Nectanebo was so actively building and supporting were functioning as the economic and administrative hubs that they had always been, managing land, organizing labor, maintaining the educational and medical and scribal traditions that were the institutional expressions of Egyptian civilization. The commercial connections with the Greek world that the Sate period had established were still functioning, channeled through Concocrates and other delta ports, and sustaining the commercial economy of the delta. The picture that emerged was not the picture of a civilization in its last days, gasping for breath. It was the picture of a civilization still very much alive, still building, still trading, still maintaining its institutional traditions with the care and precision of a people who understood those traditions as the substance of their identity. The threat was real and persistent. The Persian Empire was always there, on the eastern horizon, but it had been repelled once, and the memory of that repulsion gave the civilization a confidence in its own resilience that the events of 343 BC would ultimately not justify. This confidence is visible in the temples Nectanebo built. It is visible in the quality of the art produced under his patronage. It is visible in the administrative records that document a functioning state. It is visible in the military preparations he sustained across his entire reign. And it makes the moment of the Persian breakthrough all the more devastating. Not because it was unexpected in principle, but because it came in a form and with a thoroughness that the previous successful defense had made seem less than inevitable. Everything he built said, "We intend to continue." The Persian army of Artaxerxes III said otherwise. The physical landscape of 4th century Egypt, which shaped every military calculation that both Nectanebo and his Persian opponents had to make, was itself one of the most strategically complex environments in the ancient world. The Nile Delta, the broad, fan-shaped expanse of river channels, marshes, agricultural land, and coastal inlets that stretched from the apex of the delta, near modern Cairo northward to the Mediterranean, was a natural fortress of extraordinary effectiveness when properly defended. The multiple mouths of the Nile, the extensive marshland between the channels, and the specific geography of the coastal approaches combined to create a defensive environment that had, historically, made the conquest of Egypt from the east enormously difficult. The fortress city of Pelusium, at the northeastern corner of the delta, guarded the most direct land approach from Asia, the route that any eastern army invading Egypt would have to take. It had been the critical military objective in every eastern invasion of Egypt since the New Kingdom, the Assyrian invasion of Esarhaddon, the first Persian conquest of Cambyses, and now the invasions that Nectanebo and his predecessors had to defend against. The city sat at the junction of land and marshland, controlling the approach through the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean coast and the impassable swamps to the south. To take Egypt from the east, you had to take Pelusium first. Every Egyptian military strategist understood this. Every Persian invasion plan was built around it. Nectanebo II fortified Pelusium and the other eastern delta strongpoints with the resources of his building program and his military budget. The archaeological evidence for these fortifications, partially visible in the landscape near the modern Suez Canal zone, suggests substantial construction in the 30th dynasty period. He was not passive in the face of the Persian threat. He built the defenses. He positioned the army. He made the strategic preparations that the previous successful defense suggested were necessary. What he did not, and perhaps could not, fully anticipate was the specific combination of factors that the Persian invasion of 343 BC would bring. A Persian army significantly larger than any previous invasion force, Greek mercenaries on both sides who negated the specialized expertise advantage that had previously favored the Egyptian defense, and a commander in Artaxerxes III, who was both militarily effective and diplomatically sophisticated enough to exploit the specific vulnerabilities in Nectanebo's defensive arrangement. These factors will be examined in full in later sections. For now, what needs to be established is the foundation, the civilization that Nectanebo was trying to defend, the institutional reality of the 30th dynasty state, and the specific context that makes his reign not simply the last chapter of something ending, but the fullest expression of something that had been building. Across the 60 years of restored native rule, across the entire late period, across the entire 3,000-year tradition it was trying to preserve, right up to the moment when it could no longer be preserved. The foundation is this: Nectanebo II was not a weak ruler managing a dying civilization. He was an active, building, militarily capable pharaoh governing a genuinely functioning state in the most complex geopolitical environment in the ancient world. His failure was not the failure of inadequacy, it was the failure of specificity, the specific failure of a specific state facing a specific force at a specific historical moment, when the available tools were not quite equal to the available threat. That distinction between inadequacy and specificity is the difference between a story about decline and a story about a specific ending. The story of Nectanebo II is the second kind, and understanding it requires understanding the foundation it was built on, which is what this section has been establishing. Now the story moves into the years of his reign itself. Now we begin to see him clearly. There is one more element of the foundation that this section must establish before the account can move forward, and it is an element that distinguishes Nectanebo's story from every other in this series: the legend. Within a generation of Nectanebo's flight from Egypt, stories began to circulate about him. Not administrative records or temple inscriptions, or the kind of documentary evidence that Egyptologists typically work with, but stories. narrative accounts of the last pharaoh that placed him in contexts far beyond the historical record. Some of these stories were circulating in Egypt, some were being told in Macedon, of all places. Some were appearing in the Greek world, in forms that combined historical memory with mythological elaboration, in the way that ancient popular narrative always combined the two. The most extraordinary of these stories, and the one with the most remarkable subsequent history, placed Nectanebo in Macedonia at the court of King Philip II, where he reportedly used his magical arts to disguise himself as the god Ammon and father a child on Philip Queen Olympia's. The child in this story was Alexander the Great. This story is fiction. Alexander was not the son of an Egyptian pharaoh magician. He was the biological son of Philip of Macedon. The story belongs to the genre of legendary biography that the ancient world applied to its greatest figures, the same impulse that made Romulus and Remus the sons of a god, that made various Greek heroes the sons of Zeus, that made the authorship of the most significant human achievements attributable to divine or semi-divine agency. But the story's content, the specific claim that Alexander's real father was the last native Egyptian pharaoh, reveals something important about how the ancient world understood the relationship between Egypt and the Macedonian conquest. It says, the conquest of Egypt by Alexander was not the replacement of one civilization by another. It was the return of Egypt to itself, the restoration of the native royal line through a lineage that had continued, in supernatural form, through the body of the last pharaoh's son. The conquest was a homecoming. This legend will be examined in full later in this account. For now, it serves as an introduction to the principle that the story of Nectanebo II is not simply a story about what happened during his reign. It is also a story about what happened to his memory afterward, about how the loss of the last native pharaoh was processed by the civilization that lost him, and by the civilizations that came after. That story is as important, in its own way, as the historical story of the temples and the battles and the flight into the desert. Both stories are true. Both deserve to be told. The foundation is now established. The story can begin. The British scholar Alan Lloyd, whose work on the late period has been discussed throughout this series, noted in one of his most important essays on the 30th dynasty that Nectanebo II presents the historian with an unusual and unusually demanding interpretive challenge, a figure who is simultaneously very well documented by the standards of the period in his physical legacy, the buildings, the inscriptions, the foundation deposits, and very poorly understood in terms of his actual experience, his strategic thinking, his personal qualities, and the specific texture of his reign. The monuments speak. The man is largely silent. This silence is different from the silence around the Sete pharaohs, where the problem was primarily the inaccessibility of the delta sites and the loss of the administrative archives. In Nectanebo's case, the Upper Egyptian monuments are accessible and studied. What is missing is the papyrological and archival evidence that would allow us to see inside the 30th dynasty state in the way that the Demotic papyri allow us to see inside the Sete state. The administrative record of Nectanebo's reign is thin, not because the administration did not exist, but because the specific conditions of preservation have not favoured it in the way they favoured later periods. What we have is the stone, the temples and the kiosks and the statuary and the inscriptions, and the stone says one thing with absolute consistency. This civilization knew what it was, valued what it was, and was building its own continuation with the full resources of its ability and its commitment, right up to the moment when the Persian advance made continuing impossible. The stone does not speak of fear, it speaks of confidence. And that confidence, even knowing what came next, demands respect. The reign of Nectanebo II began in 360 BC, when he overthrew his uncle Teos, the second pharaoh of the 30th dynasty, and ended in 343 BC, when the Persian army of Artaxerxes III broke through the Egyptian defences at Pelusium. 18 years. Across those 18 years, every major decision Nectanebo made was shaped by a single overriding reality. Persia was always coming. Not continuously, not in a constant active military pressure, but as a persistent strategic reality that determined the character of his domestic policy as much as his military preparations. Every temple he built was, among other things, a statement of permanence against the threat of impermanence. Every Greek mercenary he hired was a preparation for the confrontation that he knew was eventually inevitable. Every diplomatic connection he maintained with the Greek world was a potential source of military support when the crisis arrived. The entire architecture of his reign, administrative, military, diplomatic, religious, was organized around the single problem of maintaining Egyptian independence against Persian imperial ambition. This was not paranoia. The Persian Empire under Artaxerxes III, who came to the throne in 358 BC, 2 years into Nectanebo's reign, was actively and explicitly committed to the reconquest of Egypt. Egypt was an embarrassment, the most prominent remaining example of successful resistance to Persian authority in the empire's western territories, a demonstration that provinces could revolt and maintain their independence, a source of inspiration for other restive populations within the imperial system. Artaxerxes III was a determined, capable ruler who had spent the early years of his reign consolidating his internal position through a series of ruthless measures, including the execution of potential dynastic rivals, before turning his attention to the unfinished business of Egyptian reconquest. The first major Persian invasion attempt of Nectanebo's reign came in 350 BC, 8 years after his accession, 4 years after Artaxerxes came to the throne. The force was large, a combined Persian and Greek mercenary army that attacked Egypt from multiple directions simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the defensive system that Nectanebo had built around the eastern delta. The invasion failed. Nectanebo's defensive preparations, the fortifications at Pelusium and the other eastern approaches, the Greek mercenaries under capable commanders, the flooding of the cultivated land to create impassable obstacles for the Persian infantry, held. The Persian army withdrew. This was the most important military event of Nectanebo's reign, and it is the event that the surviving sources describe with the most detail. The Greek mercenary commander Diophantus the Athenian played a crucial role in organizing the defensive positions. The flooding strategy, deliberately inundating the agricultural land of the delta to prevent Persian movement through it, was executed with the organizational precision that the Egyptian state had been developing for the purpose of exactly this kind of defense for decades. The combination worked. Egypt repelled the Persian Empire again. The victory of 350 BC had consequences that shaped the remaining 7 years of Nectanebo's reign before the second and final invasion. It confirmed his personal authority. A pharaoh who had successfully defended Egypt against the most powerful empire on earth was a pharaoh whose legitimacy could not be easily challenged. It demonstrated that the specific defensive system he had built was adequate to repel a Persian force of the scale that the 350 invasion had represented, and it created, perhaps most damagingly, a confidence in that defensive system that may have made the specific adaptations required against the larger and differently organized force of 343 less visible until it was too late. But here's the problem. Between the successful defense of 350 BC and the failed defense of 343, the strategic landscape changed in ways that Nectanebo could monitor but not control. The first change was the progressive consolidation of Persian control over the Greek mercenary market. The Persian Empire, following the failure of the 350 invasion, undertook a systematic effort to reduce the supply of Greek military talent available to Egypt. This was not simply about hiring more mercenaries for Persian service, though the Persians did that. It was about applying diplomatic and economic pressure to the Greek city-states that supplied the mercenaries, making it progressively more costly to send soldiers to Egypt and more beneficial to remain in Persian good graces. By the 340s, the pool of available Greek military expertise from which Nectanebo could draw had been significantly reduced by Persian diplomatic activity. The second change was the scale and organization of the Persian force itself. The invasion of 343 BC was not simply a larger version of the invasion of 350. It was a qualitatively different military operation. Artaxerxes III had spent the years between the two invasions systematically learning from the failure of the first attempt. He had hired the best available Greek commanders, including Mentor of Rhodes, one of the most experienced Greek mercenary generals of the era, to design a Persian offensive operation that specifically accounted for and countered the Egyptian defensive methods that had worked in 350. Mentor of Rhodes and his colleague Bagoas, a Persian general of considerable ability, designed an invasion that attacked Egypt simultaneously at multiple points along the eastern delta, not in the single concentrated thrust that the 350 invasion had used. By distributing the assault across multiple axes, the Persian force prevented Nectanebo from concentrating his defensive strength at a single critical point. The flooding strategy, which had been so effective in 350, was less effective against multiple simultaneous attacks across a broad front. The fortifications at Pelusium, which were the strongest point in the Egyptian defensive line, could be bypassed when simultaneous pressure elsewhere in the delta threatened to cut the defensive position from its lines of communication and supply. The result was not a single decisive battle, but a sequence of pressure points that progressively degraded the Egyptian defensive position until Nectanebo, recognizing that the delta could not be held, made the decision to withdraw south toward Memphis. The retreat to Memphis, the ancient capital, the city at the junction of the delta and Upper Egypt, was not an immediate surrender. Memphis was fortified. Memphis had its own defensive potential. If Nectanebo could stabilize the situation at Memphis, if the Persian advance could be checked there, then the campaign was not yet irretrievably lost. The precedent from 373 BC, when Nectanebo I had successfully used the delta geography to stall a Persian invasion until the Persians withdrew, suggested that patient defense could still reverse the situation. But the situation of 343 was not the situation of 373. The Persian force was larger, better organized, better commanded, and more specifically adapted to countering Egyptian defensive methods. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Egypt were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, negating the specialized expertise advantage that had been a key Egyptian strategic asset. And the psychological momentum of the Persian advance, city after city in the delta falling, the defensive line progressively contracting, was producing the conditions under which sustained organized resistance becomes progressively harder to maintain. And it gets worse. The specific strategic intelligence available to Nectanebo as the crisis developed was imperfect in ways that the surviving sources do not fully document, but that can be inferred from the outcomes. He appears to have believed, at various points in the campaign, that defensive positions were more secure than they proved to be. He appears to have overestimated the ability of his Greek mercenary forces to maintain coherent defensive lines against the dual pressure of Persian infantry and the more experienced and better coordinated Greek mercenaries fighting under Mentor of Rhodes. He appears, in short, to have been fighting the previous war, the successful defense of 350, rather than the specific different war that 343 actually was. This is one of the most common patterns in military history. A commander who has won with a specific method becomes attached to that method and applies it to a situation where the method's effectiveness has been specifically countered. It does not make Nectanebo a poor commander. It makes him a human commander, operating under time pressure and with imperfect information, making the reasonable mistake of relying on what had worked before. At Memphis, the situation became irretrievable. Persian forces were advancing south along the Nile, bypassing Memphis in a move that threatened to cut the city off completely. The garrison that remained was not adequate to sustain a prolonged siege against the full Persian force. And at some point in the summer or autumn of 343 BC, the precise timing is uncertain in the surviving sources, Nectanebo made the decision that ended his reign. He rode south. He did not surrender. There is no record of a formal capitulation, no ceremony of submission, no moment of humiliation before the Persian king. He simply left. He took what remained of his personal guard and whatever movable resources could be organized in the time available, and he rode south along the Nile, past Thebes, past the great temples of Karnak and Luxor that he had maintained and expanded, past the sites of his building program that stretch along the entire length of the Egyptian Nile. He rode toward the southern desert, and at some point, beyond the Nile Valley, beyond Egypt itself, he disappeared from the historical record. He did not come back. The ancient sources are divided and incomplete on where Nectanebo went after his flight from Egypt. The most credible account suggests he went to Nubia, to the kingdom of Kush, the ancient Nubian civilization south of the first Nile cataract that had been part of Egypt's world for 3,000 years and had once, under the 25th dynasty, ruled Egypt itself. If Nectanebo went to Nubia, he was going to a kingdom that had its own complex relationship with the pharaonic tradition, that had maintained Egyptian cultural forms in modified versions for centuries, and that might plausibly have offered refuge to a displaced Egyptian pharaoh. Whether he spent the rest of his life in Nubia, whether he attempted to organize resistance from there, whether he died there, or somewhere else entirely, the historical record does not say. The last native pharaoh of Egypt ended not with a death on a battlefield or a ceremony of surrender, but with a disappearance into the south and the silence of a record that simply stopped recording. Here is what makes this truly terrifying in its own specific way. The silence in the record is not simply the absence of information. It is the active termination of the recording apparatus itself, the administrative machinery of the 30th dynasty, the scribes, the temples, the institutional infrastructure that had been maintaining the Egyptian record was reorganized under Persian administration after the conquest. The continuity of that record-keeping was broken. The specific tradition that would have recorded what happened to Nectanebo after his flight was the tradition that his flight had ended. This is the deepest form of the silence around Nectanebo. Not the silence of neglect, as with the Site pharaohs, not the silence of burial, as with the archives of Sais. The silence of a record that stopped because the person who had been maintaining it, the 30th dynasty state, ceased to exist. The last native pharaoh of Egypt disappeared into silence, and the silence was the sound of 3,000 years of pharaonic history ending. The temples he left behind kept speaking. The legend that grew around him kept speaking. But the man himself, the historical person, the specific human being who had governed Egypt for 18 years with genuine competence and genuine commitment, that person became, within a generation of his disappearance, more legend than history. And the legend is the next part of this story. The specific texture of the Persian invasion of 343 BC, the campaign that ended native Egyptian rule, deserves a more detailed examination than the strategic overview above provides, because the details reveal not simply a military defeat but a specific human catastrophe, experienced by specific people in specific places, that the abstract language of ancient military history tends to obscure. The ancient sources for this campaign are multiple and imperfect. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian writing in the 1st century BC, provides the fullest surviving account, drawing on earlier sources that are now lost. The Egyptian Demotic Chronicle, a priestly text that interpreted the reigns of the late-period pharaohs through a theological lens, provides indirect evidence for how the campaign was understood in Egypt itself. The Greek historian Arrian, writing about Alexander the Great's later conquest of Persia, provides comparative evidence for the scale and organization of Persian military operations in this period, and the scattered references in other ancient sources, Strabo, Aelian, Polyaenus, add details that the fuller accounts do not preserve. From these sources, the picture of the 343 campaign emerges in broad outline, though the specific chronology and the precise sequence of engagements remain subjects of scholarly debate. What is clear is that the Persian force was enormous, the largest assembled for the Egyptian campaign in the empire's history, drawing on contingents from across the full extent of the Persian imperial territories. Diodorus gives figures that are almost certainly exaggerated in the way ancient military tallies tend to be exaggerated but the general picture of a force substantially larger than anything Nectanebo had previously faced is confirmed by the speed and comprehensiveness of the outcome. The Greek mercenary element of the Persian force is particularly significant and requires specific attention. The commander-mentor of Rhodes was not simply a hired professional. He was a man with specific prior experience of Egypt. He had served in Egypt previously, under an earlier attempt at reconquest, and had detailed knowledge of the Egyptian defensive system and its specific vulnerabilities. His ability to design a Persian campaign that specifically countered the methods that had worked in the 350 defense reflected this personal knowledge in ways that no Persian commander relying only on general intelligence reports could have replicated. The presence of Greek mercenaries of this quality on the Persian side was itself a consequence of the specific diplomatic environment of the mid-4th century BC. The Greek city-states were exhausted, internally divided, and increasingly subject to the pressure of Macedon under Philip II. The steady supply of experienced Greek soldiers who had previously found employment with Egypt was being disrupted by the political and economic changes in the Greek world, as the traditional independence of the city-states that had supplied the mercenaries gave way to the new Macedonian hegemony. The mercenary market was being reorganized by forces that Nectanebo could not influence and could only partially compensate for. The specific failure at Pelusium, the moment when the Persian advance broke through the Egyptian defensive line, is described in the ancient sources with varying degrees of specificity. What is clear is that the breakthrough was not a single dramatic assault, but a progressive process of pressure that eventually made the position untenable. The flooding strategy, which Nectanebo had relied on, was less effective against a Persian force that had anticipated it and had prepared the engineering resources to manage it. The coordinated multi-point assault prevented the concentration of Egyptian defensive strength at any single critical location. Once the Pelusium position was broken, the Persian advance through the delta was swift. City after city submitted or was taken. The great delta cities, Tanis, Bubastis, Sebennytos, Mendes, the cities that had been the commercial and administrative centers of the 30th dynasty, passed into Persian hands in rapid succession. The psychological impact of each successive fall accelerated the next. A garrison commander who sees the neighboring city submit or be overwhelmed faces a calculation in which continued resistance appears not as courage but as pointless sacrifice, and the rational choice under sufficient pressure is accommodation. There is a specific account in Diodorus of the fall of the delta city of Bubastis, the city with the great temple of the cat goddess Bastet, the city where the 30th dynasty had been born, that captures the human reality of this process. The Persian commander Bagoas, Diodorus reports, threatened to massacre the population if the city resisted and promised safety if it surrendered. The city surrendered. This was not cowardice. It was the rational response of a population that understood correctly that their pharaoh's capacity to protect them had been broken, and that the alternative to surrender was death for a cause that was already effectively lost. Nectanebo, witnessing the progressive collapse of his defensive position, made the decision to retreat toward Memphis. The decision was militarily rational. Memphis was more defensible than the open delta, and a position at Memphis might allow him to stabilize the situation and prevent the Persian advance from extending into Upper Egypt without an additional costly campaign. But the decision also had the effect of abandoning the delta population to Persian administration, and the delta populations, pragmatic, commercially oriented, accustomed across generations of late-period history to the politics of accommodation with whichever power was dominant, made their accommodations accordingly. The Memphis phase of the campaign is the most poorly documented in the surviving sources. Nectanebo was at Memphis. He had forces. The city was capable of defending itself for a period. But the Persian advance was not simply military. It was also psychological and diplomatic, designed to accelerate the collapse of the Egyptian will to resist rather than to grind through a prolonged siege. The specific mechanism by which Nectanebo concluded that Memphis was also untenable is not clearly described in any surviving source. What is described in the sources is the departure. At some point in the second half of 343 BC, Nectanebo rode south out of Memphis with what remained of his personal following. The great city, the city whose name in the ancient Egyptian language meant enduring and beautiful, the city that had been the administrative capital of Egypt since the first dynastic period, the city of Ptah and the Apis bulls and the Serapeum, with its centuries of sacred bulls buried in their enormous granite sarcophagi. This city was left to the Persians, and the last native pharaoh of Egypt disappeared into the south. The temples that line the Nile south of Memphis, the great complex at Abydos, the temples at Dendera, the complex at Karnak, and Luxor at Thebes, were, as Nectanebo passed them, the most concrete expression of what he was leaving behind. His own cartouches were inscribed on many of them. His grandfather's foundation deposits were buried beneath their floors. 3 generations of the 30th dynasty had built these structures as statements of permanence, as arguments that Egyptian civilization would endure. Nectanebo, riding past them on his way south, was passing the evidence of his own ambition and his own failure. Or was it failure? This is the question that the story of Nectanebo refuses to resolve cleanly. The temples survived, the traditions they embodied survived, the specific institutional knowledge of the Egyptian priestly class, the astronomical knowledge, the medical knowledge, the theological knowledge, the artistic traditions, the scribal traditions, all of this survived the Persian reconquest because it was embedded in institutions too deep and too essential to the administration of the Nile Valley for the Persian governors to disrupt. The Persians, who took over Egypt in 343 BC, needed the temples to function, needed the priests to maintain their service, needed the agricultural management systems that the temple establishments had always provided to continue operating. The institutional foundation of Egyptian civilization was, once again, more durable than the political form that had been built on top of it. But the political form, the native Egyptian pharaoh governing on Egyptian terms, was gone. And this time, unlike in 525 BC, there would be no return. The native dynasties would not return after 343. The Persians ruled for a decade, and then Alexander came, and after Alexander the Ptolemies, and then Rome, and then the Byzantine Empire, and then the Arab conquest, and then the world that exists today. Through all of it, the pharaoh remained someone else's ruler wearing Egypt's crown. The grief in this is specific and irreducible. It is not the grief of a civilization that was failing before its ending. It is the grief of a civilization that was building right up to the moment of its ending, that had temples under construction when the Persian army arrived, that had priests preparing for the next ritual cycle, that had scribes keeping the records with the meticulous care of a tradition that expected to continue indefinitely. The ending was not the culmination of a decay, it was the abrupt external imposition of a discontinuity that the civilization itself did not generate and did not deserve. This is the core problem in its fullest expression, not the military failure, which was the product of specific circumstances and specific decisions, but the cultural rupture, the severing of the thread of native self-governance that had run, with interruptions through 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The interruptions had always ended. The pharaonic tradition had always reasserted itself through the expulsions of the Hyksos, the expulsions of the Assyrians, the expulsions of the Persians after the Saite dynasty fell. Each time, the deep institutional substrate of Egyptian civilization had proven resilient enough to survive the foreign administration and eventually to generate a native restoration. After 343 BC, the restoration never came. Not because the institutions were weaker, but because the external forces were too large and too fast and too comprehensively dominant to allow the conditions for restoration to develop. The Persian Empire, then Alexander, then the Ptolemies. Each successive power managed Egypt efficiently enough, and with enough institutional sensitivity, that the specific conditions of discontent and organizational capacity that had produced the previous native restorations never quite coalesced into another successful revolt. The last native pharaoh rode south. The world that might have restored him never quite assembled. There is a specific document from the period immediately after the Persian reconquest that illuminates the specific character of the rupture with unusual clarity. It is an Aramaic papyrus, part of the administrative correspondence of the Persian satrapial administration, that describes, in the dry language of bureaucratic record-keeping, the assignment of properties previously belonging to Egyptian temples to Persian administrative use. The document is not dramatic, it is routine. That is precisely the point. For the Persian administration, the reorganization of Egyptian temple properties was a routine administrative matter, the kind of thing that the imperial bureaucracy handled as a standard element of incorporating a new territory into the imperial system. For the Egyptian priests whose institutional world this document was reorganizing, it was not routine. It was the material expression of what the defeat at Pelusium had meant, the transfer of control over the physical and economic resources of the institutional substrate of Egyptian civilization, from native Egyptian hands to foreign imperial administration. The temples continued to function. The Persians were not abolishing Egyptian religion, but the specific relationship between the pharaoh and the temples, the theological structure in which the pharaoh's support of the temple institutions was both an obligation and an expression of cosmic order. That relationship was broken in a way that the temple institutions themselves could not repair from the inside. The Egyptian Demotic Chronicle, a priestly text that interprets the reigns of the late period pharaohs through a theological lens, written during the Ptolemaic period but drawing on earlier priestly traditions, records the reigns of the 30th dynasty pharaohs, including Nectanebo II, with the specific evaluative framework of the Egyptian religious tradition. The chronicle assesses each pharaoh's reign in terms of his fulfillment of the ritual obligations to the gods and his maintenance of the divine order. Its verdict on Nectanebo II is complex and tells us something important about how the Egyptian priestly tradition understood his reign and its ending. The chronicle's theological logic attempts to explain the Persian reconquest within the framework of divine will, a framework that had to make sense of how the gods could allow a righteous pharaoh to be defeated and expelled by impious foreigners. The explanations it offers are the explanations that the theological tradition always offered in the face of incomprehensible loss, the working of divine purpose that operates on a timescale beyond human comprehension, the temporary nature of any disruption in the divine order, the eventual restoration that theological logic required. They are, in their way, the same explanations that the priests of the 26th dynasty had constructed for the first Persian conquest. The same theological framework that had sustained Egyptian resilience through every previous disruption. But this time, the restoration did not come, and the priests who continued to maintain the Egyptian traditions under Persian rule, and then under Macedonian rule, and then under Ptolemaic rule, had to find ways to sustain the theological confidence in eventual restoration across centuries of foreign dominance, during which the native restoration never materialized. This is one of the most psychologically extraordinary feats of institutional endurance in the history of any civilization, maintaining a living theological tradition centered on the expectation of divine restoration through 600 years of continuous foreign rule. That they managed it is testimony to the depth of the foundation that Nectanebo and his predecessors had built. The temples held, the traditions continued, the faith persisted, and the last native pharaoh, riding south through the dark, became not simply a historical figure, but the symbol around which all of this institutional endurance was organized. That is the core problem in its most complete form, and that is why the legend matters as much as the history. Something is wrong with our assumptions about ancient history if we continue to treat Nectanebo's reign as simply a prelude to the better documented world of Alexander and the Hellenistic age. The 18 years of Nectanebo II's rule were not a prologue. They were a chapter, dense with building, with military engagement, with diplomatic activity, with the specific challenges of maintaining a civilization's independence against structural pressure, that deserves examination on its own terms, rather than as the context for someone else's more famous story. The scale of the building alone demands this. Modern surveys of the surviving monuments from the 30th dynasty period have identified Nectanebo's contribution across more than 30 major temple sites in Egypt. At Karnak alone, the great temple complex at ancient Thebes that represents the most continuously developed religious site in the ancient world, Nectanebo contributed 2 major gates, several smaller structures, and extensive building inscriptions that place him in the direct line of pharaonic tradition at one of its most sacred sites. At Hermopolis, at Sohag, at Abydos, at Dendera, at Edfu, the same pattern, meticulous, confident, technically accomplished construction that expressed the 30th dynasty's conviction that it was building for the ages. The ages received the buildings. Even the Persian reconquest did not destroy them. The temple that Nectanebo built at Philae, specifically the great colonnade known as the Kiosk of Nectanebo I, and the wider structures added by Nectanebo II, survived not just the Persian conquest but 2,500 years of subsequent history, including the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s and 70s of the modern era, which would have submerged the Philae temples permanently if UNESCO and the Egyptian government had not organized the extraordinary engineering operation that moved the entire island complex to higher ground before the dam's reservoir flooded the original location. Think about that. The temples that Nectanebo's dynasty built were important enough, 2,300 years after his flight from Egypt, that an international effort was organized to preserve them from the rising waters. The buildings that were supposed to express permanence survived long enough for the modern world to decide they were worth saving. The last native pharaoh of Egypt built things that outlasted 3,000 years of foreign rule. That is not a footnote, that is the headline. And then there is the art. The portrait statues of Nectanebo II that survive, a small number distributed across Egyptian museums and collections elsewhere, show the same quality of psychological presence and technical refinement that characterized the best site work and that the 30th dynasty inherited, refined and expressed in its own specific idiom. The face of Nectanebo that looks out from the basalt head in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is not a stylized type. It is a face, a specific individual human face rendered in the hardest available stone with the finest available technique, carrying the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of Egyptian sculptural tradition and expressing, through that knowledge, a specific human being. Look at it if you ever find yourself in Cairo. It looks back, and it leads directly into the next part of this story, the exploration of who Nectanebo was, what he built, how he managed the Persian threat, and why the legend that grew around him after his departure may be the most important thing he left behind. The story has been circling its most extraordinary elements since the beginning of this account. Now it is time to examine it directly. Now we go deeper. Now we look at the temples, and the battles, and the legend together, and at what the combination reveals about one of the most remarkable endings in the history of the ancient world. Chapter 1. The Builder and His Temples. There is a specific quality to the surviving monuments of the 30th dynasty that no description fully captures, but that every person who has spent time with them tends to remark upon. It is the quality of absolute conviction. These are not the buildings of a civilization that doubts its own permanence. They are the buildings of a tradition so fully in possession of its own forms, so completely at ease with the 3,000-year vocabulary of Egyptian sacred architecture, that the specific historical moment of their construction, the 4th century BC, with the Persian Empire always on the horizon, leaves almost no trace in the aesthetic character of the work itself. The Kiosk of Nectanebo I at Philae is the clearest single example of this quality. Stand before it, and it is possible to stand before it. The island complex having been rescued from the rising Aswan Reservoir by the UNESCO operation of the 1960s and 70s and reinstalled on a nearby island where it can still be visited. And what you see is a structure of extraordinary poise. The columns, each carrying a different variety of plant form capital, lotus, papyrus, palm, rise from a low platform to a height that creates an open, airy interior lit by the Egyptian sun from every direction. The proportions are exact. the relationship between the height of the columns and the spacing between them, between the mass of the structure and the lightness expressed in its open sides, between the formality of the architectural vocabulary and the natural quality of the plant-form decoration. These relationships are calibrated with the confidence of a tradition that has been making exactly these calculations for 3,000 years and knows what it is doing. The kiosk was not completed. The capitals were never carved with their full relief decoration. The screens that would have filled the spaces between the lower columns were never installed. The structure stands as an unfinished statement, permanently frozen at the moment when the work was interrupted. The interruption, almost certainly the Persian reconquest of 343 BC, is visible in the absence of the final carving, in the surfaces that were prepared and then abandoned. The building stopped mid-sentence. This unfinished quality is itself a kind of testimony. It says, they were still building when the end came. The tradition did not stop because it had run out of things to do. It stopped because of the political conditions that had sustained it were abruptly removed. The work was in progress. The scale of the 30th dynasty building program, distributed across sites from the Delta to the First Cataract, has only been fully mapped in the modern era through systematic survey work that assembled the dispersed evidence from the sites where Nectanebo's cartouche appears. The survey, conducted by multiple scholars across the 20th century and synthesized by Alan Lloyd and others in the systematic studies of the period, revealed a building program that was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary for a ruler whose dynasty lasted only 60 years. Temples were not simply maintained under the 30th dynasty. They were built. New structures, new gates, new sanctuary additions, new processional ways, new kiosks, across the entire length of Egypt with a consistency that implies both the resources to fund the work and the organizational capacity to coordinate it across hundreds of kilometers of Nile Valley. The organizational capacity is itself significant. Managing a large-scale building program across the full length of Egypt required the same kind of centralized administrative infrastructure that the pharaonic tradition had always depended on. Trained architects, experienced quarrymen and stone cutters, organized transport networks for moving stone from quarry to site, the administrative apparatus to coordinate payments and supply chains, and the management of the specialist labor. The 30th dynasty maintained all of this. The building program was possible because the state was functional. Chapter 2. The sarcophagus nobody claimed in 1808 CE. During the period of French occupation of Egypt that followed Napoleon's campaigns, a large green basalt sarcophagus was found at the site of Alexandria, the city that Alexander the Great had founded in 331 BC, 8 years after Nectanebo's flight from Egypt. The sarcophagus was enormous, approximately 3 meters long, cut from the finest green basalt in the Egyptian quarrying tradition. Its interior carved with small figures of deities and hieroglyphic texts from the Book of the Dead. The exterior was covered with the dense, precisely carved hieroglyphic inscription that was the standard form of late-period elite funerary texts. The sarcophagus was taken to England, eventually arriving in the British Museum in London, where it can be seen today in the Egyptian galleries. For most of the 19th century, scholars assumed that it was the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great himself, that the Macedonian conqueror had been buried in an Egyptian-style sarcophagus in the city that bore his name. The assumption seemed reasonable. The sarcophagus was found in Alexandria. It was of extraordinary quality, and the location was consistent with the ancient tradition that Alexander had been buried in the city he founded. But the inscriptions told a different story. When the hieroglyphic texts were carefully read, they contained the royal titulary of Nectanebo II, the full 5-name pharaonic titulary of the last native pharaoh of Egypt. The sarcophagus was not Alexander's, it was Nectanebo's, or rather it had been intended for Nectanebo. The evidence, the incomplete state of some of the decoration, the specific character of the inscription, suggests that the sarcophagus was prepared for the pharaoh's burial, but was never actually used for it. When Nectanebo fled Egypt in 343 BC, his prepared tomb and sarcophagus remained in Egypt. He never returned to be buried in it. The sarcophagus sat in its intended location until it was repurposed. In what context by whom, and for what purpose is not entirely clear from the surviving evidence, and eventually ended up at Alexandria, where the French soldiers found it more than 2,000 years after it was carved. When the British Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, writing in the early 20th century, described the discovery of the sarcophagus's true identity, he noted that the moment of recognition, when the cartouche of Nectanebo was identified in the inscription and the initial assumption about Alexander was overturned, was one of the more striking reversals in the history of Egyptological scholarship. The object that had been assumed to be the final resting place of one of the most celebrated conquerors in history turned out to be the empty burial preparation of the man Alexander's conquest had displaced. The empty sarcophagus is one of the most haunting objects associated with Nectanebo, a ruler who built temples for permanence, who prepared a burial monument in the finest available material with the full ceremony of the pharaonic tradition, who expected to be buried in Egypt in the manner of his ancestors, and then fled before any of this could be used. The sarcophagus survived. He did not come back to use it. It is currently in the British Museum, in the Egyptian galleries, labelled and explained in the standard museum fashion. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. Among the more extraordinary objects connected to the story of the last native Egyptian pharaoh, it sits in patient, empty silence. Chapter 3. The legend begins within a generation of Nectanebo's departure from Egypt, perhaps less. Stories began circulating about him that went considerably beyond the historical record. This is not unusual for figures who disappear from the historical record without a clear ending. The human need to complete the narrative, to give shape and meaning to an abrupt silence, tends to generate exactly the kind of legendary elaboration that Nectanebo's disappearance produced. The most important of these stories was the one that eventually became known to modern scholars as the Alexander Romance, a narrative cycle about the life and deeds of Alexander the Great that was not written by any single author but accumulated across several centuries and multiple languages, a series of legendary additions to the historical account. The Alexander Romance was one of the most widely circulated texts in the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world, surviving in more languages and more copies than almost any other narrative from the ancient world. In the Alexander Romance, Nectanebo plays a specific and extraordinary role. He is presented as a magician king who had maintained the independence of Egypt not through conventional military means, but through magical arts, specifically the construction of wax models of ships and soldiers that he would animate in a tub of water, using them as proxies to fight magical battles that determined the outcome of the real battles fought by real armies. When the magical battle went against the wax models of the Egyptian army, Nectanebo understood that the gods had ordained Egypt's defeat by Persia, and he fled, not because he was militarily defeated, but because he understood, through his magical arts, that resistance was cosmically futile. After fleeing Egypt, in the Romance's account, Nectanebo travelled to Macedonia, to the court of King Philip II. There, using his magical knowledge and his skill in astrology, he ingratiated himself with the court and eventually contrived to spend a night with Philip's queen Olympias, disguised as the god Ammon. The child conceived of this union was Alexander. Nectanebo was, according to the Romance, Alexander's actual father. The implications of this story, which was widely known and widely believed in the ancient world, or at least widely told, are profound. If Alexander was the son of Nectanebo, then Alexander's conquest of Egypt was not the replacement of one civilization by another. It was the return of the native pharaonic bloodline to the throne. When Alexander went to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa in the western desert, and was hailed as the son of Ammon, the divine recognition he received was not simply a piece of foreign flattery. It was the recognition of his actual divine ancestry, the Ammon blood that his Egyptian father had carried into his Macedonian mother's womb. Alexander was pharaoh, not because he had conquered Egypt, but because Egypt was already his by blood. The story resolved, within the framework of ancient narrative logic, the most troubling aspect of the end of native Egyptian rule. How could the gods have allowed 3,000 years of pharaonic legitimacy to end? The answer in the Romances version was that it had not ended. The lineage had continued through the magical intervention of the last native pharaoh in the body of the greatest conqueror of the age. The ending was not an ending, it was a transformation. Chapter 4. The Scholar and the Text in 1881 CE. A German classical scholar named Bernd Müller was working in the manuscript collections of a monastery in northern Greece, a monastic library that had been accumulating texts since the Byzantine period, when he encountered a manuscript that he recognized immediately as significant. It was a late Byzantine copy of a text that scholars had been looking for in various forms for decades, a version of the Nectanebo episode from the Alexander Romance that preserved features not found in any other surviving manuscript. The manuscript tradition of the Alexander Romance is one of the most complex in ancient and medieval textual history. The Romance survives in hundreds of manuscripts in more than a dozen languages: Greek, Latin, Armenian, Syriac, Arabic, Ethiopian, Old French, Middle English, and many more. Each version slightly different from the others, each having accumulated its own additions and modifications as it passed through successive copying and translation. Tracing the original form of the Nectanebo episode through this maze of variant texts is one of the more demanding exercises in ancient textual scholarship. The work of scholars like Müller and, in the 20th century, the Hungarian classicist Richard Stoneman, who produced the most comprehensive modern edition and study of the Alexander Romance in English, gradually assembled a picture of how the Nectanebo story developed and spread. What they found was a narrative that had begun as Egyptian. The earliest forms of the story show clear Egyptian cultural features, including specific details of Egyptian magical practice and Egyptian theological concepts, and had then been progressively adapted and modified as it moved through Greek, Latin, and eventually Arabic and Western European traditions. The Egyptian origin of the story is particularly significant. It means that the legend of Nectanebo as a magician king was not simply a Greek invention superimposed on Egyptian history. It was, at least in its earliest form, an Egyptian story, a story produced within the Egyptian priestly tradition as a way of making sense of the specific historical event of the last native pharaoh's disappearance. The theological logic of the story, that the pharaonic bloodline continued through Nectanebo's supernatural intervention, was Egyptian theological logic constructed within the Egyptian framework of divine kingship and dynastic legitimacy. Stoneman noted, in his introduction to the Alexander Romance, that the Nectanebo episode is the most distinctively Egyptian element in the entire Romance tradition, the element most likely to derive from Egyptian priestly sources, rather than from Greek literary invention. He argued that the specific details of Egyptian magical practice described in the narrative are too technically accurate to be Greek inventions. They reflect a knowledge of Egyptian temple magic that only someone familiar with Egyptian priestly traditions could have supplied. This suggests that the legend of Nectanebo the Magician King was not simply popular mythology. It was priestly mythology, the product of the Egyptian temple establishments that had served Nectanebo during his reign, and that continued to maintain the Egyptian cultural traditions after his departure. The priests who built the legend were the institutional heirs of the men and women who had served Nectanebo in the temples he had so lavishly supported. Their maintenance of his memory, transformed, mythologized, made into a vehicle for the theological claim that pharaonic legitimacy had continued through his son Alexander, was their specific form of loyalty to the tradition he had embodied. Chapter 5. The Pelusium dig in 1994 CE. An Egyptian-Austrian archaeological team began systematic excavations at the site of ancient Pelusium, the fortress city at the northeastern corner of the delta that had been the critical military objective of both Persian invasions and the scene of Nectanebo's final defeat. The site, now known as Tel el-Farama, had been identified by earlier archaeologists but never systematically excavated. The new excavation aimed to recover the physical evidence of the ancient city and, if possible, to find direct evidence for the military events of 343 BC. What the excavation found over the following years was a site of layered occupation, extending from the Late Bronze Age through the Islamic period, the accumulation of thousands of years of human activity at a single strategically critical location. The Pelusium that Nectanebo had fortified was visible in the stratigraphy as a specific layer, building material, pottery, and small finds from the 4th century BC that could be dated to the period of the 30th dynasty. The military evidence, the direct physical traces of the Battle of 343, was less clear. Battles are notoriously difficult to recover archaeologically. Weapons are salvaged, bodies are buried or burned. The specific materials of combat are rapidly removed from the battlefield by the victors. What the excavation found instead was the evidence of the city that Nectanebo had defended: the fortification walls, the administrative buildings, the temple structures, the residential areas, all of it consistent with a functioning, defended city in the late 4th century BC. The lead archaeologist on the project, Muhammad Abdel Sami, described the excavation as revealing a Pelusium that was substantially more complex and substantially better organized than the pre-excavation literature had suggested. The city was not simply a military garrison. It was a complete urban center, administrative, commercial, religious, residential, whose destruction in 343 BC would have involved not simply the defeat of a military force, but the disruption of an entire functioning community. This is the reality that ancient military history tends to obscure. The battles that determine the fate of civilizations are fought in places where people live. Pelusium was not an empty fortress. It was a city. The Persian victory at Pelusium in 343 BC was not simply a military event. It was the beginning of a catastrophe for the specific people who had been living and working and raising their children inside those walls in the shadow of the same threat that their pharaoh had been building against for his entire reign. Chapter 6. After the departure, what happened in Egypt in the decade between Nectanebo's flight and Alexander's arrival? The decade of the Second Persian period, when Egypt was again a Persian province, is one of the most poorly documented periods in the entire history of the late period. The sources are fragmentary, the administrative records thin, the archaeological evidence of the period difficult to distinguish from what came immediately before and after. What is clear from the surviving evidence is that the Persian administration of Egypt in this period was significantly more disruptive than the First Persian period had been. The ancient sources, hostile, since they were mostly written by opponents of Persia, describe Artaxerxes III as having treated Egypt with deliberate destructiveness, plundering temples, removing sacred objects, killing the Apis bull at Memphis, showing systematic contempt for Egyptian religious sensibilities. Modern scholars treat these accounts with appropriate skepticism. Persian royal propaganda and the propaganda of Persian opponents were both invested in extreme characterizations, and the actual policies of the Persian governors were probably more pragmatic and more varied than the most negative accounts suggest. But there is some independent evidence that the Second Persian period was specifically disruptive in ways the first had not been. The specific treatment of the temple establishments, their properties, their revenues, their institutional autonomy, appears to have been more invasive under the renewed Persian administration, possibly reflecting a Persian decision to prevent the conditions that had allowed native resistance to organize successfully after the first conquest. The temple establishments that had been the institutional backbone of the native resistance, that had maintained the pharaonic traditions, trained the scribes and priests and administrators who had staffed the 30th dynasty state, were specifically targeted for disruption in ways that the evidence, however fragmentary, suggests were more systematic than anything in the First Persian period. If this interpretation is correct, then the Second Persian period was not simply an interlude. It was an attempt to prevent a third native restoration by disrupting the institutional foundations on which both previous restorations had rested. Whether it would have succeeded, whether the Second Persian period, left to run its course without the intervention of Alexander's conquest in 332 BC, would have permanently broken the native Egyptian institutional tradition, is a question that history, through Alexander's arrival, did not allow to be answered. Alexander arrived. He was welcomed. He went to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa and was recognized as the son of a god. He founded Alexandria and the people who maintained the Egyptian priestly traditions, who had kept the institutional knowledge and the religious practices and the specific memory of Nectanebo alive through the decade of Persian disruption, received him with the enthusiasm that the story of Nectanebo's magical fatherhood of Alexander was designed to explain and justify. The last native pharaoh's son had come home. That is what the legend said, and the legend was, in the specific way that legends are true, more accurate than the history. Chapter 7. The Sippus of Horus and the Magical Tradition. Among the most extraordinary categories of Egyptian religious object produced in the late period is a specific type of protective amulet known to Egyptologists as the Sippus of Horus, a small stone stele, typically showing the child god Horus standing on crocodiles and holding snakes and scorpions and other dangerous creatures in his hands, surrounded by magical texts that were believed to confer protection against the specific dangers depicted. These objects were used as healing and protective devices. Water poured over a Sippus of Horus was believed to become magically charged with the protective power of the inscription and could be drunk or applied to wounds as a treatment for snakebite, scorpion sting, or other injuries inflicted by the creatures shown on the stele. The number of these objects produced in the 30th dynasty period is remarkable. They appear in extraordinary quantities in the archaeological record, suggesting a significant expansion of this specific form of popular religious practice during the reign of Nectanebo and his predecessors. They were produced at multiple quality levels, from the finest basalt pieces clearly intended for elite patrons to the rough limestone examples that ordinary Egyptians could afford, suggesting that this specific form of magical protective practice was genuinely widespread across social classes. One of the most important and most studied examples of the Sippus of Horus tradition is the Metropolitan Sippus. Now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a large, beautifully carved example from the 30th dynasty period, whose magical texts have been published and analyzed by the American Egyptologist John Borgautz and others. The Metropolitan Sippus is exceptional in its completeness. Most surviving examples are damaged, the texts imperfect, the carving worn, and its texts provide one of the most detailed available windows into the specific character of the magical tradition that the 30th dynasty priestly class maintained. The magic described in these texts is specific, procedural, and theologically sophisticated. It draws on the mythology of Isis and Horus, specifically the story of the infant Horus being bitten by a scorpion in the marshes of the Delta, while his mother Isis had temporarily left him to seek food, and Isis's use of magical power to heal him, as the foundation for a practical system of magical healing that the Egyptian priestly tradition had been developing for centuries. The practitioner who used a sippus was, in the theological logic of the tradition, reenacting the divine healing, channeling through the magical object the same power that Isis had used to save her son, directing it toward the healing of the person who had drunk the water poured over the stele. This is the magical tradition that the Alexander Romance describes Nectanebo as practicing, not folk magic or superstition, but a sophisticated priestly art deeply embedded in the theological framework of Egyptian civilization. The characterization of Nectanebo as a magician in the Romance tradition was not an insult or a reduction. It was an attribution of the highest form of Egyptian priestly expertise to the last native pharaoh. He was, the legend said, a master of the most sophisticated knowledge his civilization had produced, and the civilization that produced this knowledge was not a civilization in decay. It was a civilization that had been maintaining and developing this specific tradition for 3,000 years, and that, under the 30th dynasty, was expressing it at a level of technical sophistication that the surviving evidence fully confirms. The magical texts on the Metropolitan Sippus and the thousands of other similar objects from the 30th dynasty period are the concrete evidence of what Nectanebo's civilization knew and valued and practiced. They are the evidence that the civilization being ended by the Persian conquest at Pelusium was, at the moment of its ending, fully alive, creative, confident, and producing objects of genuine cultural and intellectual complexity. That complexity deserves recognition, and it cannot be adequately recognized without the specific context of the ruler who sustained and patronized the tradition in its final native expression. That ruler was Nectanebo II, and his story has not yet been fully told. Chapter 8. The Alexander Encounter and its Meaning. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt with his Macedonian army. He had just defeated the Persian forces at the Battle of Issus, and had spent the following year securing the Levantine coast. Egypt, still in the disarray of the Second Persian period, offered no significant resistance. The Persian satrap surrendered the country without a major battle. Alexander went to Memphis. He performed the pharaonic coronation ceremonies. He was recognized by the Egyptian priesthood as the legitimate pharaoh, the son of the gods, the living Horus, the embodiment of divine order in the throne of Egypt. He visited the oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, and the oracle recognized him as the son of a god. The Egyptians welcomed him. This is the historical fact that requires explanation, and the Alexander romance provides the explanation, the mythological explanation, the one that made theological sense within the Egyptian framework of divine kingship and dynastic legitimacy. If Nectanebo was Alexander's father, then the welcome was the recognition of a native prince returning from exile. The conquest was not a conquest, it was a restoration. Whether the Egyptian priesthood actually believed this story, in the literal sense of believing that Nectanebo had fathered Alexander on Olympias, is impossible to determine, and probably the wrong question. The story served a function within the Egyptian theological framework. It provided the narrative that made Alexander's rule theologically legitimate within the pharaonic tradition, connecting the Macedonian conqueror to the last native pharaonic bloodline, and transforming a foreign conquest into a divine restoration. Whether this narrative was believed or was deployed pragmatically by the priestly establishments that needed to accommodate the new political reality is a distinction that the ancient world did not necessarily make as sharply as modern audiences might. The political reality was that Alexander was now pharaoh. The theological reality, in the Egyptian framework, required that Pharaoh be the legitimate continuation of the divine kingship tradition. The Nectanebo story provided the specific genealogical link that the theology required, and the priesthood, the institution that had the authority to pronounce on matters of theological legitimacy, endorsed it. This endorsement shaped the entire subsequent Ptolemaic period in ways that are still visible in the archaeological record. The Ptolemaic pharaohs, the Greek-speaking dynasty that Alexander's general Ptolemy established after Alexander's death, and that ruled Egypt for 300 years until Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, maintained the pharaonic traditions with the same meticulous attention that the native dynasties had given them. They built temples in the traditional Egyptian style. They learned Egyptian. They performed the pharaonic rituals. They were recognized by the Egyptian priesthood as legitimate pharaohs in the direct line of succession from the native Egyptian kings. The specific temples of the Ptolemaic period that most visibly continue the 30th dynasty tradition are the great sanctuaries of Edfu and Dendera, enormous, perfectly preserved, covered with the dense hieroglyphic decoration and the traditional iconographic programs that the Egyptian religious tradition had been developing for 3,000 years. These temples were built not by native Egyptian pharaohs, but by the Greek Ptolemies, in a tradition whose continuity with the native past was, in part, secured by the specific mythological framework that linked Alexander back to Nectanebo. The math is striking. The temple tradition that Nectanebo sustained and built with such commitment, the tradition expressed in the unfinished kiosk at Philae, in the temples at Karnak and Abydos, and across the Nile Valley, continued, under Ptolemaic patronage, for 3 more centuries. The architectural forms were maintained, the theological texts were elaborated, the ritual practices were sustained, the institutional knowledge accumulated through 3,000 years of priestly tradition was preserved and transmitted in the specific institutional framework that Nectanebo's building program had supported. This is the echo of Nectanebo that reaches furthest into the future, not the historical reign, not the battles and the buildings and the diplomatic alliances, the legend. the story of the magician king whose son restored the pharaonic tradition in a new form. Whether the story is true does not determine whether its consequences are real. Chapter 9. The Serapeum and the Last Apis. Among the most important archaeological sites directly connected to the 30th dynasty is the Serapeum at Saqqara, the great underground necropolis of the sacred Apis bulls that was discussed earlier in this series in connection with the Saite dynasty. The Serapeum continued to function throughout the 30th dynasty period, receiving the mummified remains of successive Apis bulls in their enormous granite sarcophagi, each burial recorded on the stelae that provided the chronological anchors for the late period that modern scholars depend on. The last Apis bull burial from the reign of a native Egyptian pharaoh. The last burial associated with a 30th dynasty cartouche is associated with the reign of Nectanebo II. The stele that records this burial is one of the final primary source documents of native Egyptian rule. It records, in the dry formulaic language of the Apis cult, the death of a bull and the installation of its successor, the dates of both events, and the name of the pharaoh under whose reign they occurred. It is routine. It is the record of a civilization that was still functioning. After Nectanebo's flight, the Serapeum continued to receive Apis bulls under Persian, and then Macedonian, and then Ptolemaic administration. The sequence was not broken by the conquest, but the specific royal cartouche that appears on the stele changes, from Nectanebo's cartouche to the cartouche of Artaxerxes III, and then to the cartouche of Alexander and the Ptolemies. The record of the bulls continues. The pharaonic name above it changes. The French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, who excavated the Serapeum beginning in 1851 CE, encountered the 30th dynasty burial galleries as part of a sequence that extended continuously from the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. When he stood in the gallery that contained the last Apis sarcophagus from the reign of a native pharaoh, he was standing at a physical point in space and time that corresponded to one of the most significant transitions in the history of the ancient world. The next sarcophagus in the sequence, the next burial record, was from the reign of a Persian king. Mariette later wrote about the experience of working through the Serapeum galleries as one of the most profound archaeological experiences of his career, not because of any single dramatic discovery, though the Serapeum contained plenty of those, but because of the accumulative weight of the continuous sequence. Bull after bull, generation after generation, dynasty after dynasty. The same ritual, repeated at the same site across more than a millennium. The record maintained with the same meticulous care through invasions and conquests and regime changes that would have been catastrophic for any less institutionally embedded tradition. The tradition was not destroyed in 343 BC. It was redirected, placed in service of a new political authority, while maintaining its essential institutional character. This is the deepest truth about the resilience of the Egyptian temple tradition. It was capable of continuing under almost any political authority that was willing to respect the basic conditions of its functioning. What it could not do, what the departure of Nectanebo definitively ended, was continue under the authority of a native Egyptian pharaoh. Chapter 10. The fragment in the British Museum. There is a specific piece of evidence for the reign of Nectanebo II that exemplifies the kind of scholarly detective work that the late period requires, and that illustrates both the richness of what is available and the fragmentary character of how it survives. In the Egyptian collection of the British Museum, there is a limestone relief fragment from a temple wall. Approximately 30 centimeters square, its edges irregular, where it was broken from the larger composition of which it was once a part. The relief shows a portion of a royal figure in the standard pharaonic stance, the striding pose, 1 foot forward, that Egyptian relief carving had used for the royal image since the Old Kingdom. The figure carries the crook and flail, the traditional symbols of royal authority. The inscription beside the figure, in hieroglyphs, contains the cartouche of Nectanebo II. The relief is, by the standards of the finest Egyptian carving, good but not exceptional. It is the work of a competent workshop producing competent official art in the standard late-period idiom. What makes it significant is what it represents: a fragment of a specific building at a specific site that was interrupted. The break in the stone, the irregular edge where the fragment separated from the larger composition, is almost certainly a break of destruction rather than of natural deterioration. The stone was broken, not worn. It is possible, probable, according to the specialists who have studied the piece, that this fragment is from one of the temples or other buildings that were specifically damaged or dismantled during the Second Persian period, when the Persian administration targeted the 30th dynasty's institutional infrastructure for disruption. If so, then the fragment in the British Museum is a piece of evidence for the specific way in which the end of native Egyptian rule expressed itself at the level of physical monuments, not total destruction. The temples, by and large, survived, but specific, targeted damage designed to interrupt and disrupt rather than obliterate. The fragment is not labelled with this interpretation in the museum. It sits in its case with its standard academic description: late period, 30th dynasty, limestone cartouche of Nectanebo II. It looks like what it is, a piece of a broken relief. But the break itself, the irregular edge, the evidence of interruption rather than completion, is the specific physical record of the moment when the building stopped, when someone broke the stone, when the 30th dynasty's building program, extending across 30 sites since 18 years of Pharaoh's life, came to its abrupt, external, politically determined end. That fragment is the physical remains of the ending, and it sits in a glass case in London, waiting for whoever is willing to read what the break in the stone says. Chapter 11. The Oracle and the Strategy. There is a specific account in Diodorus Siculus that describes Nectanebo's behaviour in the final phase of the 343 invasion, the phase when the defensive position in the delta was clearly deteriorating and the decision of whether to continue resistance or withdraw was approaching. The account is brief and its reliability is uncertain, as all accounts of the inner decision-making of ancient rulers must be, but it preserves something that the purely military and administrative evidence cannot supply: a glimpse of how Nectanebo himself understood what was happening. According to Diodorus, Nectanebo during this period consulted oracles and used his knowledge of astrology and divination to assess the situation. The oracles told him that the gods had ordained Egypt's defeat. They told him that the moment was not propitious for continued resistance, and Nectanebo, receiving this information, made the decision to withdraw rather than to fight on in a situation that divine consultation had identified as hopeless. This account is consistent with the Alexander Romance tradition, which presents Nectanebo as a man whose primary tool was magical and oracular knowledge rather than conventional military force. But it is also consistent with the actual strategy Nectanebo pursued. The withdrawal was not a panicked flight, but a calculated decision to preserve what could be preserved: his person, his following, his capacity to organize resistance in the future, rather than sacrifice everything in a last stand whose outcome divine consultation had indicated was foreordained. Whether or not Nectanebo actually consulted oracles in this way, and the Egyptian pharaonic tradition was deeply invested in oracle consultation as a form of divine guidance, making it entirely plausible that he did. The decision logic the account describes was sound. A pharaoh who stays and is captured loses not just his freedom, but the possibility of organizing future resistance. A pharaoh who withdraws retains that possibility, at least in principle, at least for as long as he survives. Nectanebo chose survival. Whether the survival was organized around any specific plan for restoration, whether he had a strategy for eventual return, whether he was attempting to build support in Nubia or elsewhere for a future campaign to reclaim his throne, we do not know. The record does not say. What it says is only the departure and the subsequent silence. The departure was rational. The silence that followed, the silence of 3,000 years of pharaonic sovereignty, ending without formal ceremony, without recorded death, without the burial that the elaborate funerary preparations had been designed to provide, is the haunting element. The ending of the native Egyptian pharaonic tradition was not a dramatic last stand. It was a horse riding south through the dark, a figure receding into the desert until the dust settled and the record stopped. This is the ending that 3,000 years of civilization deserved and did not receive. There was no tomb, no ceremony, no formal transmission of authority. There was only the departure and the silence. And then, after the silence, the legend. The legend was the civilization's response to the ending it did not want. The priests, who built the story of Nectanebo the magician king and his divine son, Alexander, were doing what human beings and human communities do when the ending is too abrupt, too undignified, too incomplete to accept as the whole truth. They gave it a completion. They made the ending into a transformation. They said this did not end. It continued. It continues. And in a specific institutional, culturally traceable sense, they were right. The temples stood. The traditions continued. The knowledge was transmitted. The institutional memory of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, carried in the bodies and the practices of the priestly class, maintained in the physical infrastructure of the temple establishments, passed through the Persian decade and the Macedonian conquest and the Ptolemaic period, and eventually into the late antique world in forms that still shape aspects of the world we inhabit today. The last native pharaoh disappeared into the south, but the civilization he embodied did not disappear with him. It persisted, transformed and continuing through every subsequent era of foreign rule, maintaining the specific continuity that was the deepest thing the pharaonic tradition had always claimed. Not the permanence of any specific political form, but the permanence of the divine order that the political form had been built to serve. That continuity is Nectanebo's most important legacy, and it is the legacy that this account now turns to in full. The continuity that Nectanebo's legacy represents is not the continuity of political form. The native Egyptian pharaoh governing through the theological framework of Mat, the living Horus, maintaining cosmic order. That specific form ended with his departure. The continuity is the continuity of the institutional tradition. The temples, the priests, the scribal practices, the artistic vocabulary, the theological knowledge. These did not end in 343 BC. They continued, under Persian and Macedonian and Ptolemaic and Roman administration, until the slow transformation of late antiquity gradually dissolved them into the Christian and Islamic forms that replaced them. The last hieroglyphic inscription at Philae, carved in 394 CE, that is, 737 years after Nectanebo's flight from Egypt, was carved in a temple complex that his dynasty had built. The tradition continued in the physical structure he had created. The tradition persisted because the structure persisted, and the structure persisted because it was built well enough by people who cared enough to last. That is the final word on the building program. That is why it matters that Nectanebo built the things he built in the places he built them. Not because building temples could stop a Persian army, but because the things he built became the physical containers of the tradition's continuation. The structures within which the priests continued to chant, and the scribes continued to copy, and the knowledge continued to pass from generation to generation, long after the man who built the structures had ridden south into the desert and disappeared. He built for permanence. He achieved permanence. Not his own, not the personal permanence of a pharaoh buried in his sarcophagus with the full ceremony of 3,000 years of tradition behind him, but the permanence of the tradition he served. And that, in the end, is the larger permanence. That is the one that mattered most. Slow down. Look at the full span of what this account has been describing and of what this entire series of accounts has been building toward. This is the ending of something 3,000 years old. Not the ending of Egypt. Egypt continued and continues as a civilization and as a place. Not the ending of the Egyptian people. The biological and cultural descendants of the people who built the temples and kept the records and chanted the rituals are still in the Nile Valley, still present, still connected in complicated and genuine ways to the extraordinary civilization that occupied this landscape for 3 millennia before any of the events described in this account. Not even the ending of the Egyptian religious tradition, which continued in institutional form for another 700 years after Nectanebo's departure, but the ending of the specific political form, the native Egyptian pharaoh as the living embodiment of divine order, governing on Egyptian terms through the Egyptian theological framework, responsible to no foreign authority and accountable to no imperial structure above the level of the divine order itself. That ending was in 343 BC. It was the departure of Nectanebo. It was the horse riding south through the dark, carrying the last man who would ever hold that title as a native, as an insider, as someone formed by the tradition rather than adopting it. Let that sink in. Not as a geopolitical fact, not as the strategic outcome of a campaign or the administrative result of an imperial reorganization, as a human fact, as the ending of the specific experience of being the kind of person that the native Egyptian pharaoh was, a person formed from childhood in the framework of 3,000 years of accumulated theological knowledge and ritual obligation, who understood himself as the living axis around which the cosmic machinery of the universe was organized, who performed the rituals not as a performance for others, but as a genuine service to the divine order that the Egyptian tradition had been maintaining since before recorded history. That experience, the specific inner experience of being the last of 3,000 years of that tradition, is inaccessible to us. We cannot enter it. The surviving records do not preserve it. What we have are the monuments and the administrative documents and the legendary accounts, all of which are external to the experience rather than expressions of it. The man himself, the specific inner life of the person who was Nectanebo II, who knew himself as the last native pharaoh, is gone in the most complete sense, not just absent from the record, gone. This is the grief at the center of the story of Nectanebo, not the loss of the temples which survive, not the loss of the tradition which continued in institutional form for centuries, the loss of the person, the disappearance of the specific human being who embodied something 3,000 years old at the moment of its ending, the rider who went south and did not come back. The Egyptian theological tradition had extensive resources for processing the death of a pharaoh. The elaborate funerary practices, the mummification, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, the canopic jars, the funerary equipment, the ritual ceremonies that accompanied the burial, were all designed to manage the specific transition of the pharaoh from the living world to the afterlife world. The transition was not treated as a loss. It was treated as a transformation. The pharaoh's soul completed its journey through the underworld, was weighed against the feather of Mat, was received by Osiris, and continued in the eternal life of the divine realm. The mummified body preserved the physical form. The funerary texts provided the navigational guidance. The ritual ceremonies performed by the priests maintained the connection between the living and the dead. Nectanebo had none of this. His sarcophagus sat empty in Egypt. His body was somewhere in the desert south of the Nile Valley. If it survived at all, which the ancient world of the 4th century BC did not guarantee, there was no mummification, no funerary ceremony, no formal passage through the ritual framework that the Egyptian tradition had developed across 3,000 years to manage exactly this kind of transition. The last native pharaoh of Egypt died. If he died, the record does not say when or how. Outside the institutional context that the tradition had always provided for the management of his specific kind of death. This is the deepest rupture, not the military defeat, not the political subordination, the rupture in the specific ritual continuity that the pharaonic tradition had maintained across 3,000 years as its most fundamental institutional obligation. The pharaoh's death had always been managed, ritually, institutionally, by the temple establishments that served him. Nectanebo's death, whenever and wherever it occurred, could not be managed in this way. The tradition that would have managed it had been disrupted by the same event that produced his departure. This is not science fiction. This is the specific, concrete, humanly real consequence of the ending of native pharaonic rule. The ending was not just a geopolitical event. It was the specific disruption of a ritual continuity that had run, unbroken, for more than 3,000 years. Every pharaoh before Nectanebo had been buried. Every pharaoh before Nectanebo had had his passage through death, managed by the institutions that the pharaonic tradition maintained for exactly this purpose. Nectanebo was the first, and the last, pharaoh for whom this specific continuity was broken. The priests who maintained the traditions after his departure understood this. The legend they built around him, the story of the magician king and his divine son, was their specific response to this specific rupture. It said, the tradition is not broken. The divine order is not disrupted. The specific form has changed, but the substance continues. The last native pharaoh's son is on the throne. The blood continues. The sacred order is maintained. This is the deeper truth about the legend. It was not simply a story. It was a theological response to a theological crisis. The unprecedented situation of a native pharaoh whose death could not be ritually managed, whose burial could not be conducted, whose passage through the afterlife could not be ensured by the institutions that had always provided this service. The legend provided an alternative. If Nectanebo did not die but transformed, if his essence continued in the body of Alexander, if the native pharaonic bloodline persisted through the supernatural paternity that the legend described, then the specific continuity that the ritual tradition maintained was not broken. It was transformed, changed in form but not in substance. Let that sink in. The legend of Nectanebo and Alexander was not simply mythology. It was the Egyptian priestly tradition's specific, technically sophisticated, theological response to the most extreme crisis that the tradition had ever faced: the disappearance of the pharaoh without the ritual management of his death. The legend provided the continuation that the ritual could not. And it worked. Not in the sense that anyone literally believed that Nectanebo had fathered Alexander on Olympias in Macedonia, but in the sense that the theological framework it provided, the framework that made Alexander's pharaonic rule theologically legitimate within the Egyptian tradition, allowed the institutional substrate of Egyptian civilization to continue functioning under Macedonian rule with the same commitment and the same meticulous care that it had maintained under native rule. The temples continued to be built, maintained, and operated. The priestly traditions continued to be transmitted. The hieroglyphic writing system continued to be used. The specific forms of Egyptian religious practice, the rituals, the festivals, the theological texts, continued to be performed and recorded. The tradition continued for 700 years after Nectanebo's departure, long enough to transmit to the late antique world the accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, which then passed through the channels of early Christian and Byzantine and eventually Islamic intellectual transmission into the modern world. This continuity is Nectanebo's most important legacy. It was not produced by any single one of his specific actions. It was produced by the cumulative effect of the building program and the institutional investment and the support for the temple establishments that his reign and the reigns of his 30th dynasty predecessors had sustained. The foundations were deep enough to carry the tradition through the specific rupture of the departure, through the Persian decade, through the Macedonian conquest, through the Ptolemaic period, all the way to the last hieroglyphic inscription at Philae in 394 CE. The foundation held because Nectanebo and his predecessors had built it to hold. That is the deeper truth. Not the tragedy of the departure, though the departure was tragic. Not the failure of the defense, though the defense failed. The deeper truth is the durability of what was built, and the specific commitment of the people who built it, and the long, slow, invisible consequence of that durability across 700 years of subsequent history. 3,000 years of civilization, 118 years of restored native rule across 3 dynasties, and the longest unbroken sequence of native pharaonic governance since the Sete period. A building program of extraordinary scope and quality. A legend that shaped the self-understanding of the most consequential conqueror of the ancient world, and the institutional tradition that carried the deepest knowledge of Egyptian civilization forward through every subsequent transformation. That is the full account of what Nectanebo II accomplished and what his reign meant. It is considerably more than the silence around him suggests. There is a specific way in which the story of Nectanebo II connects to every previous account in this series, to Psamtik I, to Necher II, to Amasis, that the individual accounts cannot fully convey, and that this cumulative moment makes visible. The Site period and the restored native dynasties of the 4th century BC were not separate historical episodes. They were phases of a single extended story. The story of Egyptian civilization's attempt, across 2 centuries of external pressure and occasional direct conquest, to maintain the specific form of native self-governance that the pharaonic tradition had always understood as the expression of divine order. Each pharaoh in this story, Psamtik with his patient restoration, Necho with his outward-reaching ambition, Amasis with his brilliant 44-year cultivation of the cosmopolitan synthesis, and finally Nectanebo with his building program and his military resistance, was working on the same problem: how to maintain the sovereignty of the oldest civilization on Earth against the pressure of an increasingly interconnected and increasingly powerful external world. None of them fully solved this problem, but each of them made a genuine contribution to the civilization's capacity to survive, and each of them did it with the specific qualities of their specific moment. The survival was real, the contribution was real, and the failure, when it finally came irreversibly in 343 BC, was not the failure of any of these individual rulers. It was the failure of the specific structural conditions that had made their successes possible. Those conditions having been systematically dismantled by forces beyond any individual ruler's control. This is the view from sufficient distance, and it is the view that makes the story of Nectanebo and of the entire late period from Psamtik to the Persian reconquest something more than a tragedy. It is the story of 2 centuries of genuine civilizational achievement under conditions of persistent existential threat, 2 centuries during which the oldest civilization on Earth maintained its institutional identity, built its monuments, transmitted its knowledge, and expressed its specific understanding of what human civilization was and what it was for, right up to the specific moment when it could no longer do so. 2 centuries. That is not a brief interlude. That is the span of time from the Declaration of American Independence to the present. In that span of time, the civilization we are discussing produced some of the finest art of the ancient world, maintained the most extensive temple building program since the New Kingdom, cultivated the most sophisticated diplomatic connections in the history of the late period, and contributed, through the specific encounter with the Greek world that the Scythe period made possible, to the intellectual foundations of what we now call Western civilization. These contributions did not vanish with the departure of the last native pharaoh. They had already been transmitted through the commercial networks of Naucratis, through the Greek intellectuals who had visited Egypt and engaged with the Egyptian priestly traditions, through the specific mythological framework that the Nectanebo legend provided for the Ptolemaic period's continuation of the temple tradition. The transmission was real, the influence was real, and the civilization that was transmitted in these imperfect, mediated, partially distorted forms was the civilization of Psamtik and Necho and Amasis and Nectanebo. The deeper truth of the entire series is this: the civilization whose story has been told across these accounts did not simply end in 343 BC, it transformed. The political form ended. The institutional substrate continued, and through the institutional substrate, the specific knowledge and the specific values and the specific ways of engaging with the world that 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization had developed passed into the forms that came after. The Ptolemaic, the Roman, the early Christian, the Byzantine, the Islamic, and through all of those forms, in traces and fragments and indirect influences that are still being traced by historians and archaeologists and scholars of ancient religion into the present, we are, in ways that are real but difficult to fully trace, the heirs of the civilization that Nectanebo II was the last native pharaoh of. The calendar we use, the solar calendar with 365 days, organized into months of regular lengths, is the direct descendant of the Egyptian solar calendar that the pharaonic tradition maintained across 3,000 years. The mathematical concepts in the Egyptian papyri, the earliest examples of certain geometrical calculations that later appeared in Greek and then in European mathematics, are part of the ancestry of the mathematical tradition we inherit. The astronomical knowledge preserved in the Egyptian temple records contributed through Alexandrian transmission to the astronomical tradition that eventually produced modern astrophysics. None of this makes the ending of Egyptian rule less significant or less mournable. The ending was real, and the loss was real, and the specific human beings who lived through it, who saw the Persian army arrive at Pelusium, who watched Nectanebo ride south, who continued to maintain the temple traditions in the uncertainty of what came next. Those people experienced a genuine catastrophe. However much the institutional tradition they maintained proved durable enough to survive it. The grief is real, the loss is real, and the mourning deserves to be proportionate to what was lost. Not simply a government or a dynasty or a political form, but the specific, irreplaceable experience of a people governing themselves on their own terms through their own tradition. An experience that 3,000 years of accumulated history had produced, and that one generation of external military pressure had ended. This is what the silence around Nectanebo conceals. Not just a pharaoh, not just a dynasty. The ending of 3,000 years of native self-governance. The rider in the dark, carrying everything that was and everything that would not return. Let that sink in one final time, and let it change how you hear the silence that follows. There is one more element of the deeper truth that this story requires, and it is the element that most directly connects the account of Nectanebo to the people who are listening to it, the Egyptian priestly tradition that Nectanebo sustained. The tradition of temple maintenance, of ritual performance, of scribal knowledge transmission, was the specific institutional form through which ancient Egyptian civilization preserved and transmitted its accumulated knowledge. It was not the only form. The monuments themselves were another, and the papyri were another, and the oral traditions were another. But the institutional form, the living, practiced, person-to-person transmission of knowledge through the specific communities of practice that the temple establishments represented, was the most resilient of all the forms. It was the one that survived the longest and transmitted the most. The Coptic Christian tradition of Egypt, the tradition that emerged from the encounter between Egyptian religious culture and the early Christian movement in the first centuries of the Common Era, is the most direct institutional descendant of this priestly tradition. The Coptic language is the final form of the ancient Egyptian language, the language of the hieroglyphs, modified to incorporate the Greek alphabet and the Greek vocabulary that the Ptolemaic period had introduced. The Coptic liturgy, still performed in Coptic Christian churches in Egypt and in the diaspora today, preserves in its specific linguistic forms these traces of the Egyptian religious practice that was already ancient when Nectanebo built his temples. When a Coptic priest performs the liturgy in the 21st century, the specific sounds of the ancient Egyptian language, sounds that have been passed from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of transmission that extends back through the Ptolemaic period, through the 30th dynasty, back to the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization, are present in the service. The chain is long and has been modified at every link, but it has not been broken. This is what the institutions that Nectanebo built, sustained and transmitted, not the specific political form of native pharaonic rule. That was gone with his departure. But the living tradition of the language, the ritual practice, the theological knowledge, the institutional memory. These survived because the foundations were deep enough, because the temples were built well enough, because the tradition was valued enough by the people who maintained it that they continued to maintain it through 700 years of foreign rule. Nectanebo built for this. Whether he knew it or not, whether his building program was consciously conceived as an investment in the tradition's long-term survival, or simply as the fulfillment of his specific pharaonic obligations, the result was the same. He built the containers in which the tradition continued. He sustained the institutions that transmitted what could not be transmitted through the monuments alone, and the transmission happened. The last native pharaoh of Egypt is in the sound of the Coptic liturgy. He is in the calendar we use. He is in the fragments of mathematical and astronomical knowledge that passed through Alexandria into the medieval and then the modern scientific tradition. He is in the specific mythological framework that the legend of Alexander preserved and that shaped how the ancient world understood the relationship between Egypt and the Macedonian Empire. He is in every museum collection that holds a piece of his building program: the basalt head in Cairo, the limestone fragment in the British Museum, the kiosk at Philae that UNESCO moved to save. He is in the ending, and in what survived the ending. Both are real, both deserve to be known. The people of Egypt today are the biological and cultural descendants, in complicated and intermixed ways, of the people who lived through all of this. Through the 30th dynasty, and the Persian reconquest, and the Macedonian conquest, and the Ptolemaic period, and the Roman period, and the early Christian period, and the Islamic conquest, and every subsequent transformation. The specific thread of continuity between the ancient world and the modern is not a single unbroken line. It is a braided cable of many strands, most of them frayed, some of them broken, but collectively intact enough to be traceable from the temples of Nectanebo to the present. The silence around Nectanebo in popular history is therefore not only a silence about an ancient pharaoh, it is a silence about the specific moment when the oldest continuous native civilization in the world lost its ability to govern itself on its own terms. It is a silence about 3,000 years of accumulated civilizational achievement coming to a specific, abrupt, externally imposed end. It is a silence about the loss that the legend was built to process, and that the institutional tradition was built to outlast. The silence can be broken, the account can be told, the name can be known, and the specific human being who embodied those 3,000 years at their ending, who built the temples, and organized the defense, and consulted the oracles, and rode south through the dark when the building and the organizing and the consulting were no longer adequate, that human being deserves the specific, concrete, historically accurate recognition that this account has been working to provide. His name was Nectanebo II. He was the last native pharaoh of Egypt, and the story of his reign is worth knowing for what it reveals about the nature of civilizational endings, for what it says about the durability of institutional traditions, and for what it adds to the picture of a civilization that at the moment of its political ending was still fully alive. Now the account moves to its conclusion. Step back far enough from the story of Nectanebo II, and what comes into view is not simply the ending of a dynasty or the defeat of a pharaoh. What comes into view is one of the most fundamental questions that the study of human civilizations raises. What is a civilization, really, when you strip away the political form and look at the substrate? Egypt's political form, native pharaonic rule, ended in 343 BC when Nectanebo rode south. What remained? The temples, the priesthoods, the scribal traditions, the agricultural management systems, the institutional knowledge of 3,000 years, continued for another 700 years before even the institutional forms began to dissolve into the Christian and Islamic traditions that replaced them. The political form lasted 3,000 years. The institutional substrate outlasted the political form by 700 more. This suggests an answer to the question of what a civilization really is. A civilization is not primarily its political form. A civilization is its institutional substrate, the accumulated practices, the transmitted knowledge, the embedded ways of doing things that persist across changes in political authority. The political form is the most visible expression of the civilization, and its loss is genuinely significant. But the institutional substrate is the civilization's most durable element, and it can survive the loss of the political form far longer than the loss of the political form suggests. Egypt is the most extreme example of this pattern in the entire historical record. No other civilization on Earth maintained an identifiable institutional continuity for as long as the Egyptian religious and priestly traditions maintained theirs. The final hieroglyphic inscription at Philae in 394 CE, carved 737 years after the Battle of Pelusium in a temple complex that Nectanebo's dynasty had built by priests who were the institutional heirs of priests who had served the last native pharaoh, is the evidence of a continuity so deep that ordinary categories of civilizational survival and extinction do not fully capture it. The implication for how we think about the endings of civilizations is significant. we tend to date civilizational endings to the loss of their political forms. The fall of Rome in 476 CE, the end of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, the end of the Aztec Empire in 1521. These political endings are real and consequential, but the institutional substrates of these civilizations, the legal traditions, the religious practices, the architectural forms, the technological knowledge, the literary traditions, often survive the political endings for centuries, in forms that continued to shape the cultures that came after. The story of Nectanebo and what followed it is the most dramatic possible illustration of this pattern. The political form ended abruptly in a single campaign season. The institutional substrate continued for 700 years, and through the institutional substrate, the knowledge accumulated over 3,000 years of civilization passed into the subsequent world, shaping the development of Greek, Roman, Christian, and Islamic culture in ways that are still being traced and still being debated by the historians and archaeologists and scholars of ancient religion who work in this field. This is the implication that the story of Nectanebo most urgently presses toward the present moment. The things most worth preserving in any civilization are not its political forms, which are contingent and fragile, but its institutional substrates, the living practices, the transmitted knowledge, the communities of expertise that carry the civilization's deepest accomplishments in the bodies and the routines of the people who practice them. These are the things that outlast political catastrophe. These are the things that can be carried through the specific rupture of an ending and continued transformed in what comes after. This does not diminish the significance of political endings. The ending of native Egyptian rule was genuinely and permanently significant. It changed what was possible for the people of Egypt in ways that were not reversible, but it did not end everything. The institutional substrate was deep enough to carry the most essential elements of the civilization's accumulated knowledge through 7 centuries of subsequent foreign rule. This is what Nectanebo built, not a political structure capable of withstanding the Persian army of Artaxerxes III. No such structure was available to him. He built the institutional infrastructure, the temples, the priestly traditions, the educational systems, the scribal practices. He built the substrate. And the substrate held. The modern world contains institutions that perform the same function. Universities, libraries, scientific research communities, religious communities, artisan traditions, oral performance communities. These institutions carry the accumulated knowledge of their respective civilizations, in the same way that the Egyptian temple establishments carried the accumulated knowledge of Egyptian civilization. They are vulnerable to the same kinds of disruption that disrupted the Egyptian institutional substrate. Political pressure, economic deprivation, the loss of the specific communities of practice that maintain living traditions, and their survival across disruptions as significant as the ones that the Egyptian substrate survived, would require the same combination of depth, resilience, and the specific commitment of the people who maintain them. The lesson of Nectanebo is not that political forms do not matter. They matter enormously. The lesson is that the investment in institutional substrates is the investment with the longest-term return. The temples that Nectanebo built outlasted the dynasty he led. They outlasted the Persian Empire that defeated him. They outlasted the Macedonian Empire that Alexander built, and the Ptolemaic dynasty that followed it, and the Roman Empire that absorbed them. Some of them are still standing, in various states of preservation, 2,367 years after the last native pharaoh rode south from the defense he could not hold. Think about the implications of that specific durability. A decision made by a ruler in the 4th century BC. The decision to build specific temples in specific places with specific materials and specific levels of care has consequences that reach into the 21st century of the modern era. The kiosk of Nectanebo at Philae was important enough, 2,300 years after it was built, that an international effort was organized to move it to safety before the rising waters of the Aswan Dam could cover it. The UNESCO operation that saved Philae was, among other things, a consequence of Nectanebo's decision to build well. The stone remembered what the record forgot. The monument preserved what the history neglected. And the attention of the present moment, the attention that UNESCO directed toward the monument, the attention that archaeologists direct toward the sites, the attention that this account is directing toward the man who built it, is the contemporary expression of the name value that drove the building in the first place. The conviction that some things are worth preserving, that the effort of preservation is worthwhile, and that what has been built deserves to last. Our place on the planet that has buried so many civilizations before us is not entirely different from the place that Nectanebo occupied in 360 BC, 2 years into his reign, with the Persian Empire on the eastern horizon and the building program extending across the entire length of Egypt. He built knowing the threat was real. He built knowing that the outcome was uncertain. He built because building was the right thing to do, because the tradition he had inherited and the civilization he had been formed by were worth every resource he could invest in their continuation. He was right. The building was worth it. The tradition continued. The knowledge survived. And the last native pharaoh of Egypt, riding south through the dark of 343 BC, left behind something that outlasted everything that ended him. The only silence that remains is the one we choose to maintain about his name. That silence is ending now. The specific figure of Nectanebo II, the last of his line, the last of a line 3,000 years long, has something to say to anyone who has ever been responsible for maintaining something larger than themselves in the face of forces that threaten to end. He did not give up. He built right up to the ending. The unfinished kiosk at Philae, with its unprepared capitals, its missing screens, its surfaces that were prepared for carving that was never completed, is the most honest monument in the entire archaeological record of the late period. It says, "We were working when they came. The work was not finished, but the work was happening." This is the implication that reaches most directly into the experience of anyone living in an era of uncertainty, which is to say, anyone in any era, since uncertainty is the permanent condition of human civilization rather than the specific property of any particular historical moment. The choice between building and not building, between investing in the institutions and traditions that sustain what matters and holding back out of the fear that the investment will prove futile. This choice is always present, and the story of Nectanebo argues, through the evidence of what he built and what survived, consistently on the side of building. Build. Not because the building guarantees survival, not because the investment prevents the catastrophe. Build because the building is the expression of the conviction that what you are building matters, and that the expression of that conviction, even in the face of the approaching catastrophe, is itself a form of resistance to the catastrophe's claim that nothing is worth preserving. The stone at Philae expressed this conviction for 2,300 years before anyone organized a campaign to save it. The conviction was in the stone, and when the modern world finally looked at the stone and decided it was worth saving, it was responding to the conviction that Nectanebo had built into the rock when he ordered the kiosk constructed in the 4th century BC. That is the reflection. That is the implication. Build what matters. Build it well. Build it in the full knowledge that the ending is coming, as the ending always comes for every political form, every dynasty, every civilization, and trust that what is built well enough and valued enough will outlast the forces that end the political form and carry what matters forward into whatever comes next. Nectanebo trusted this. The evidence of 2,300 years says he was right to trust it. Now the account moves to its close. There is a final observation that belongs to this section before the account closes. The observation about the series of pharaohs whose stories have been told in these accounts taken together. Psamtik I restored what had been broken. Necho II pushed the restoration to the edges of the known world, literally. The circumnavigation, the canal begun, the fleet built. Amasis brought the restoration to its fullest commercial and cultural expression. Nectanebo II sustained what could be sustained and built what could be built, right up to the moment when the world changed in ways that made sustaining and building insufficient. 4 pharaohs, 2 centuries. the full arc of one of the most remarkable periods in the entire history of the ancient world, each of them doing the specific work that their specific moment required, each of them contributing, in their specific way, to the institutional depth that allowed the tradition to survive the ending that their combined efforts could not prevent. The ending was not their failure. The ending was the specific consequence of specific historical forces that were beyond any individual ruler's capacity to permanently arrest. What they achieved in the time they had, the temples, the trade networks, the diplomatic connections, the cultural renaissance, the institutional investments, was real and significant and has left traces in the modern world that are still being identified and still being studied. The silence that has surrounded all four of these pharaohs in popular history is the silence that this series of accounts has been working to break. Each account has been a specific, documented, historically grounded argument that the silence is not warranted, that the evidence supports recognition, that the achievements deserve to be known, that the specific human beings who produce them deserve the same kind of historical attention that more famous and more conveniently documented rulers of other civilizations routinely receive. The argument is complete, the accounts are given, the names have been spoken. The silence now is the listeners to fill or maintain. The Nile runs south to north. This is one of the stranger geographical facts about the river that made Egypt possible. Stranger because the convention of maps places north at the top, creating the impression that all rivers run downward toward the bottom of the page. The Nile runs against this convention. It rises in the mountains of Central Africa and flows northward through the desert and into the Mediterranean. The water moves from south to north. The pharaoh, in the standard Egyptian cosmological framework, ruled from the south, from Upper Egypt, the upstream regions, downward and northward over the delta, the downstream regions. When Nectanebo II fled south in 343 BC, he was riding against the current. He was riding upstream, toward the source, away from the delta where the Persian army was advancing. He was riding in the direction that, in Egyptian cosmological thinking, was the direction of origin, the direction from which the Nile's creative power flowed. Whether this was simply the direction that led away from the Persian advance, or whether the specific direction of flight carried any symbolic weight in his own understanding, or in the understanding of the people who watched him go, the ancient sources do not say. What they say is only the departure, and the departure is where the historical record ends. The legend that grew in place of the historical record. The story of the magician king who fathered Alexander and whose divine blood restored the pharaonic line, circulated for centuries in forms that kept evolving and accumulating new elements as it passed through Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Arabic, Ethiopian, Armenian, and eventually medieval European traditions. The Alexander Romances, the text cycle in which the Nectanebo story found its most elaborate form, was one of the most widely read narratives of the ancient and medieval world. More copies survive in more languages than almost any other ancient text except the Bible. The story that the Egyptian priestly tradition built around the departure of the last native pharaoh reached more people across more centuries than almost any other story from the ancient world. This is a remarkable fact to sit with. The last native pharaoh of Egypt, whose historical reign has been almost completely ignored by popular history, is also one of the most widely transmitted figures in the literary history of the ancient and medieval world. Present in hundreds of manuscripts in a dozen languages, read by medieval readers from Ethiopia to Iceland, shaping the way that Alexander the Great was understood across 15 centuries of storytelling tradition. The silence around Nectanebo in popular historical consciousness exists alongside an extraordinary proliferation of his legendary presence. He is both the most neglected pharaoh and one of the most widely distributed figures in ancient narrative tradition. These two facts are not in contradiction. They are different kinds of presence, the historical and the legendary, operating in different registers. But together they reveal something important about how the ancient world processed the loss of the last native Egyptian pharaoh, not through the historical record, which was disrupted by the conquest, but through the legendary tradition, which the priestly establishments sustained as a deliberate act of cultural preservation. The answer to the title question, who was Nectanebo II, the last native Egyptian pharaoh, is now as complete as this account can make it. He was the third and final pharaoh of the 30th dynasty, ruling Egypt for 18 years from 360 to 343 BC. He was a builder of extraordinary ambition and consistent quality, whose temple program extended across more than 30 major sites, and whose architectural contributions are visible at Philae, at Karnak, at Edfu, at Dendera, and at dozens of other sites that have been catalogued by the Egyptologists who have systematically mapped his contributions to the sacred landscape of Egypt. He was a military commander who successfully repelled one Persian invasion before failing to hold against a second that was larger, better organized, and specifically designed to counter the defensive methods that had worked before. He was the subject of one of the most widely circulated legends of the ancient world, a legend that made him the father of Alexander the Great, and that shaped the self-understanding of the Ptolemaic dynasty that followed the Macedonian conquest. He was the embodiment, at the moment of its ending, of 3,000 years of native pharaonic tradition, and he disappeared into the south and did not come back. The kiosk at Philae that his dynasty began and did not finish stands on a reconstructed island near Aswan, relocated by international effort from the island it was built on to protect it from the rising waters of the Aswan Dam's reservoir. The unfinished capitals are still unfinished. The missing screens are still missing. The surfaces that were prepared for carving, that was never completed, are still smooth and uncarved, waiting for work that stopped more than 2,000 years ago. The unfinished kiosk is the most honest monument left by the last native Egyptian dynasty. It says in stone, "We were working. The work was not finished, but the work was happening." Every building program stops somewhere. Every temple left incomplete is evidence of an ending that came before the vision was fully realized. The Egyptian tradition had always understood this. The threat of interruption was always present. The inscription on the stone was always a bet against time, and time had never lost. But the tradition also understood, and had always understood, that the bet was worth making, that the building was the expression of a conviction too fundamental to be abandoned, simply because the outcome was uncertain. Nectanebo built, the stone remained. The tradition it expressed continued for 700 years after the man who built it rode away. The inscription on the stone, the hieroglyphs that carry the royal cartouche of the last native pharaoh, are still legible 2,300 years after they were carved, to anyone who has learned the writing system that the Rosetta Stone made legible again. The last native pharaoh of Egypt built things that are still standing. He built a tradition that carried the deepest knowledge of 3,000 years of civilization through 7 centuries of foreign rule. He became, in legend, the father of the greatest conqueror of the ancient world, and he disappeared into the desert south of Egypt, alone or nearly alone, in the autumn of 343 BC, carrying the last act of 3,000 years of native Egyptian sovereignty into the silence that the historical record cannot penetrate. Look at the ground beneath your feet differently. The sites of ancient Egypt are still being excavated. Every year, new papyri are conserved, and new inscriptions are read, and new building foundations are identified in the landscape of the Nile Valley. The picture of the late period that scholarship has assembled across 2 centuries of Egyptological work through the patient labour of specialists who have spent careers learning the languages and the material culture and the institutional history of a civilization that ended its native political form before the Macedonian Empire was founded, is substantially more complete and substantially more interesting than the popular silence around this period suggests. The temples of Nectanebo are accessible. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo holds his portrait statues. The British Museum holds his sarcophagus, the empty sarcophagus, the one that was never used for its intended purpose, sitting in its glass case 2,500 years after it was prepared for a burial that did not happen. The kiosk at Philae is standing on its reconstructed island near Aswan. The unfinished capitals are permanent record of a work interrupted. The silence around Nectanebo is not because the evidence is insufficient. It is because the narrative conventions of popular history have not yet made room for him. Those conventions can change. The stories can be told. The name can be known. The calendar you use was shaped, in part, by the civilization that ended with his departure. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that passed through Alexandria into the medieval and modern worlds carried traces of what his civilization had accumulated. The Coptic liturgy that is still performed in Egyptian Christian churches preserves, in the sounds of an ancient language, the faintest echo of the tradition he was the last to govern on its own terms. He was the last, and the last carried 3,000 years on his back as he rode south into the dark. His name was Nectanebo, and now you know it.